Welcome back to World Religions, a video series to accompany a semester-long Survey of World Religions course, specifically to work with the textbook A Short Introduction to World Religions, edited by Christopher Partridge. I occasionally add my own additional information and editorial commentary as well. Part 3, Hinduism. There are 5 chapters in this part, shown on the outline. 13, Historical Overview. 14, Sacred Writings. 15, Beliefs. 16, Worship and Festivals. 17, Hinduism in the Modern World. There is some overlap between the chapters, but in general, we're going to try to keep things as brief as possible. This is just a survey, an overview, and if you want to do a deeper dive into some of these topics, you'll have to look elsewhere, either to other textbooks or other videos. Chapter 13, Historical Overview. The term Hinduism can refer to different things. It can be mainly geographical. It can refer to all religions that originate in India or South Asia, named after the Indus River or Sindhu in Sanskrit. Hinduism can be categorized as a world religion, similar to Christianity, Islam, or Buddhism, just in terms of the massive numbers of Hindus in the world. There are about 1.2 billion Hindus, about 1.1 billion of whom are in India. So that's one of the things that differentiates Hinduism, though, from the other religions I just mentioned, because those are missionary religions, which throughout their history have actively sought to convert people from other faiths to their own. Historically, this has not been the case with Hinduism for the most part. That's a bit different now in modern times. There are some missionary sects of Hinduism, but most Hindus are in India, or their ancestors were from India and they took their religion with them when they migrated to other countries like the United States or South Africa, for example. So in some respects, despite its large number of adherents, Hinduism could be compared to indigenous religions, or what you might call customary religions. These are religions native to a given people or culture, and they typically are inherited along with language and other customs, rather than things that are deliberately spread through missionary activity. Hinduism does not have a single individual founder or prophet. It doesn't have a single doctrine that unifies all believers, a single creed. Now, having said this, the other religions I mentioned as well, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, they too can have diversity in theology and in beliefs. But there's more of the sense of a coherent core of beliefs, like the vast majority of Christians accept the Nicene Creed, for example, asserting the divinity of Jesus, among other things. Likewise, in Islam, Muhammad is regarded as the last and greatest of the prophets. The 5 pillars of Islam are accepted by all Muslims. Buddhism also has sets of doctrines like the 4 Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, the 5 vows that are going to be accepted by all believers. But there's more diversity in Hinduism, especially when it's used in the broader geographical sense of any religion that originated in South Asia. That could also include other traditions like Jainism and Buddhism, which have some parallels with the narrower sense of Hinduism in that they all accept reincarnation and karma and so on. Nevertheless, the term Hinduism can be used more narrowly to refer to all the various sects, religions, philosophies that are based on the Veda. This is the oldest Hindu scripture. And also, they tend to acknowledge the authority of the Brahmins or priestly class to interpret the Veda and perform its rituals. So we could also describe the various types of Hinduism as Vedic religion or as different types of Brahmanism. But it is true that Hinduism is like indigenous religions in that there's often fuzzier boundaries between it and other religions and also other aspects of daily life. It's very much incorporated into the culture of South Asia, such as with the caste system, for example. You can look at the Indus Valley civilization as the precursor of the later Hindu religion in certain respects. It's believed by scholars that the Veda was not a scripture of the Indus Valley civilization. Rather, the Veda was the scripture of another culture, the Aryans, who migrated into the Indus River Valley after the peak of the Indus Valley civilization. So the Aryans, which we'll talk about later, they brought their language, they brought the Veda, their religion, which later evolved into Hinduism. Nevertheless, it is very possible that this civilization, which is the oldest known in South Asia, influenced later Hindu beliefs and practices in certain ways. So this civilization had different phases. It had an earlier phase. The mature phase is around 2600 to around 1900 BC, and there was a later phase as well. They practiced agriculture mainly along the Indus River and its tributaries. So they were able to store a lot of grain in pottery. They built large cities such as Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. The civilization is often also called the Harappan civilization after the city of Harappa, which is its modern name. We don't know what they actually called their cities or their whole culture because we can't translate their writing system. But they did have writing. They did have standardized weights and measures. It's believed that each of the main cities was probably politically independent, but they probably had a common language, a common culture. They definitely traded with each other, and they traded even further afield as well, such as from mines to the mountains to the north, and they also traded with Mesopotamia, an even more ancient civilization to their west. So little is known, unfortunately, about the religion of the various cities of the Indus Valley civilization. They had a writing system which, if we could translate, we'd probably be able to learn something about the names and character of their gods, for example. But nevertheless, there are still some clues from the archaeological evidence. There are terracotta figurines and small seals with images, such as the one shown on the slide, which is nicknamed the Pashupati seal, or Lord of the Animals. And there's some similarities in the iconography to that of later Indian religions. The seated figure on this seal and others like it is sometimes compared to Shiva, who has an aspect as Lord of the Animals. There are other figurines and images that look like goddesses that were later worshipped in Indian religion, including Hinduism. There's no direct evidence, though, for continuity. We can't know if this is just coincidence. My personal judgment is there probably was actual continuity in the religion, at least to a certain extent, just because there were other forms of cultural continuity as well. Like another example of this, there's an ancient terracotta figurine of a dancer who has jewelry similar, like these circular bangles, similar to those worn to this day by people in nearby parts of India and Pakistan. And there was evidence that women in the Indus Valley civilization would use red ochre or pigment as decoration on their hair, and which is still done today by Hindu women. So there's probably some cultural continuity there that makes it more likely there was religious continuity as well. Another interesting bit of trivia is that one of the animals often depicted on their seals is nicknamed the unicorn because it was not a buffalo or any other known animal. It has very distinctive features, including a single horn. It's possible that the Indus Valley civilization practiced ritual bathing. So in the lower right corner of the slide is the so-called Great Bath, which is a large pool that was fed by a river. And there were similar large pools, bathing structures found in a lot of the cities, which may have had ritual significance. So bathing in the river waters, the flowing waters of the river, as a type of spiritual purification, which is still done in Hinduism today, albeit primarily with the Ganges River rather than the Indus. You'll also notice on the so-called Pashupati seal that the figure has perhaps three faces, depending on how you interpret it. It's very small, so it can be difficult to interpret the details. But there's one face looking forward to the viewer, and the markings on the sides of the face might be intended to show the profile of a nose and mouth. So this is similar to later depictions of Hindu gods that could have multiple faces or multiple heads, although you will note that this figure only has 2 arms. The posture of the figure seated cross-legged with hands on the knees is also similar to that used to depict Shiva and other gods, saints, and enlightened beings in a bunch of Indian religions, including Jainism and Buddhism. Could be a coincidence, or it could be an indication of some cultural continuity. The Aryans are the ones who are believed to have practiced the oldest form of Hinduism or Vedic religion. So the ancient Aryans came from Central Asia. They're associated with the Andhra Novo archaeological culture or material culture that's been studied by modern archaeologists. They were nomadic pastoralists. That is, they subsisted primarily on herds of animals like horses and cattle, which they could migrate with across the steppes of Central Asia. So it's believed, you can see from the upper map the migration patterns of many ancient Indo-European peoples. These are people who spoke languages, ancient languages that are ancestors of a bunch of modern languages of Europe and India and other parts of Asia, such as Iran. So this has been known since the beginning of modern linguistics in the late early 1800s. Some European scholars noticed similarities between Latin, ancient Greek, and Sanskrit, the ancient language of India, specifically of the Veda. And they realized that these similarities were probably due to the fact that all of these languages evolved from a common ancestor language. So the ancestor language is called by scholars, by linguists, Proto-Indo-European or Old Indo-European. Indo-European being a name for this larger family of later languages that descended from that common linguistic ancestor. We don't know what the speakers of Indo-European called themselves or their language, but it's believed by most scholars that they originated in the steppe of southeastern Europe, so what's now Ukraine, Crimea, and parts of southern Russia. And they may have themselves originally come, or the language may have originated in Anatolia or the mountains to the south, but the language really spread across Europe and Asia because it was taken up by this nomadic people, and they were highly mobile, highly migratory, and so their language spread with them. And as it spread, it evolved into different daughter languages, including Sanskrit, the language of the Veda, and other languages like ancient Greek and Latin, and so on. So the Sanskrit is the name used still today for the formal version of the language preserved in the Veda, and also used for a lot of other religion, philosophy, and scholarship in ancient India. Modern linguists call the spoken, the informal version of this language, Old Indo-Aryan, and later versions would be referred to, for example, as Middle Indo-Aryan, etc. So this was the people that brought their language, their culture, their religion to South Asia. Do note that many Hindus do not believe this Aryan migration theory. They reject the notion that the Aryans originated from outside of India. Many, if not most, Hindus believe that the Aryans originated inside India and then migrated outward to other parts of Asia and to Europe, bringing their language with them. This is not believed by most scholars because it's contradicted by a lot of linguistic, archaeological, and even genetic evidence. So just the linguistic evidence, for example, we can see that the other Indo-European languages could not have evolved from Old Indo-Aryan, but Old Indo-Aryan could have evolved from Proto-Indo-European. So Old Indo-Aryan could not have been the oldest version of the languages spoken by this family. And this has been confirmed by archaeological and genetic evidence. The geneticist David Reich REICH, has done a lot of work on Indian genetics. It's very interesting. So both ancient remains and modern human populations, you can often reconstruct ancient migrations just from the types of genes that are possessed by ancient and modern people. So he's written a book called Who We Are and How We Got Here. He's also co-authored several studies with other population geneticists. And one of the findings they have is that modern Indians have degrees of admixture between some West Eurasian ancestry. And this is probably representing, at least in part, that initial migration of the Aryans from the north and west in Eurasia down south into India or South Asia. But there were probably multiple waves of migrations, and there were also two different populations of North and South Indians, so it's very complicated. But the idea is there's basically good evidence that the Aryans originated from outside of India, but migrated there quite early, from around 1500 BC or so. The map on the bottom shows some of the various archaeological material cultures associated with the Aryan migration, starting with the Swat Valley in the north, and you can see other cultures to the south, Cemetery H, Copper Horde culture, and Painted Gray Ware culture. Those are all associated with the ancient Aryans as they migrated into the Indus River Valley and then further to the east in the Ganges River Valley. And they would have brought the Veda and their religion with them. The early Vedic period is roughly from around 1500 to 1100 or 1000 BC. So this is when the Aryans are migrating into South Asia. They're forming new kingdoms. They're bringing their culture, their language, their religion with them. So we get the spread of what you could call Brahmanism, or Vedic religion, or Vedic Dharma, which means moral law. So this is the tradition that is encoded in the Vedic texts, the scriptures, and the rituals performed by the Brahmins, or the class of hereditary priests. And there were also different political elements that were part of this cultural complex that spread. So there was duties expected of kings insofar as they participated in this Vedic religion. They had a duty to give offerings to the Brahmins, to support the Brahmins, and essentially pay for the Brahmins to perform offerings, rituals honoring the devas, the gods of the Veda. The grandest of the Vedic sacrifices was a sacrifice of a horse, and this would only be performed by the king. The horse was symbolic of the king's royal power. Among other things, the ancient Aryans probably primarily fought from horseback, at least initially. They may have also had horse-drawn chariots that they used, both of which would have been associated with the power of kings and rulers. So the horse sacrifice would feature letting a horse with certain specific physical traits, like it had to be all white color, if I recall correctly, let that horse roam within the king's territory for a year. And then after the year was up, it would be sacrificed to the devas, to the gods. And this would be done sometime in the king's reign, not necessarily at the very start, but the idea is it would ensure the blessedness, the prosperity of the king. In this map, the names of the ancient Aryan kingdoms, such as Bharata and Druyu, are shown in capital letters in black bold print, and the names of the various rivers are shown in blue and lowercase. You'll notice one of the rivers is dotted and is named Saraswati with a question mark. So this is a dry riverbed that probably was part of the decline of the Indus Valley civilization around where that dotted line is. And this probably was the original epicenter of the Indus Valley civilization, and after climate change it dried up, and it probably contributed to the overall gradual collapse of those Indus Valley cities. So by the time the Aryans migrated there, it was already dry, but there were still ruined cities there. There were traditions of the civilization and the cities that used to be there, and so some scholars think that the belief in this mystical river, Saraswati, which is described in the Veda, is actually a memory of that original earlier dried up river. And so again, that shows you some potential continuities between the Indus Valley civilization and the culture of the Aryans and of the Veda. And it's possible that what we call Hinduism is really kind of a synthesis or a blending of some kind between the Vedic religion and beliefs and traditions of that even more ancient Indus Valley civilization. The Veda comes from a word vid meaning known. It's related to English words like video, vision, and wisdom, showing you the connection between English and Sanskrit, both of which are Indo-European languages. There's a series of words in Indo-European languages that are similar in sound, and they tend to mean things like to know or to see. So the Veda dates from around 1500 BC or 1300 BC. There's different estimates. The estimates are based on the characteristics of the language, by the way, because linguists have theories or models for how languages tend to evolve over time. When they look at the oldest parts of the Veda, they can calculate or estimate essentially around what century they were composed in, even though they don't have internal dates that are that precise. So it took a long time, over 1,000 years, before the Veda was written down. Because in ancient India, they were actually illiterate. By the time the Aryans migrated to South Asia, the writing system of the Indus Valley civilization was no longer in use, and it was not adopted, picked up by the Aryans. Nevertheless, scholars have high confidence that the Veda, the text, was preserved accurately over those many centuries because, among other things, the various memorization techniques used by the Brahmins or the priests to transmit it. The textbook puts it something like this: the Vedas are not just read, they are articulated and performed. They're referring to the fact that Vedic chants will have a meter and a rhythm that facilitates memory. And the Brahmins go even beyond that, which itself is important. You may have noticed from your own personal experience, it's easier to remember the lyrics of a song than it is just random prose, like a paragraph of text, because the meter and rhythm of the song help encode the words in your memory. But the Brahmins have even more elaborate techniques, such as practicing reciting the same text both forwards and backwards, and they have other ones as well. So this is the oldest parts of it are very ancient. It was probably composed over several centuries, from around 1500 BC to 500 BC. The Hindus regard the Veda as timeless, as eternal, as basically not having a human author, as being authored by God, Brahman, the supreme being, and just being heard mystically by ancient seers or rishis. So they don't actually regard it as having a human author. So despite the great variety of beliefs of Hinduism, so we'll see later that there are different Hindu theologies. For example, some Hindus are polytheistic, others are monotheistic. There are still other possibilities. So there's a huge diversity of types of Hinduism, but the Veda is one of the main things that almost all Hindus have in common. They regard this as a divinely authored text. So it's also the foundation of the various later forms of Hinduism, which tend to build on the Veda. They don't try to just replace it or repudiate it. The earlier Veda, though, this is the one that was brought by the Aryans when they came to India, focuses on performing rituals, mainly sacrifices or yagyas, and singing hymns of praise to honor their gods, which are called devas. So some of the sacrifices involved killing animals in ancient times, although that is rarely performed today. Most Hindus are actually opposed to animal sacrifice, but animal sacrifices, even of cows, which today are regarded as sacred, and of other animals too, were described in the Veda. But the more common offerings would include milk, ghee or clarified butter, grain that would be placed into a sacred fire. So the Vedic rituals all involve a fire altar, which you can see in the picture. Another substance that would be given as offerings to the gods is called soma. And it's not known exactly what this was, but it was some kind of herbal concoction that when consumed would alter consciousness. So it's a mind-altering drug. It may have been the plant ephedra, which is a stimulant when consumed, and that would correspond to some of the effects that are described of consuming soma in the Veda, such as being more alert, being more creative, having visions, being able to think of poetry, being inspired, and so on. So soma was believed to be the favored drink of the gods. It was also consumed by the ancient Aryans. Apparently, though, after they migrated to India, it became harder or impossible for them to find the original plant. So that's another clue that the soma plant, whatever it was not something easily available in India or South Asia, probably more readily available in the Hindu Kush Mountains or somewhere else to the north. So the way the sacrifices would work is that they'd be performed by one or more priests, but they would have another person usually as the sponsor, the one paying for the ritual, the one giving the items to be offered, and often a wealthy person such as a king, a merchant, something like that. But the rituals are only allowed to be performed by people born into the Brahmin caste or class. Varna is the word in Sanskrit. So the priesthood in Hinduism is hereditary. You may only be a priest if you're a man born into a Brahmin family, and then you have to go into a long period of training in order to be qualified for that. So the Brahmin caste has preserved a lot of the tradition of the Veda up into the modern day. And even though, as we'll see, there are many newer forms of Hinduism, the religion has changed, it has evolved, the oldest parts of it have been preserved quite accurately for over 3,000 years. So Hinduism is actually the oldest of the world's major religions. You can contrast that with other religions like Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. Even Judaism, which is also quite ancient, and Zoroastrianism are probably not as old as the beginnings of Vedic religion. There are many devas or gods described, named in the early Veda. By the way, the word deva in Sanskrit is related to the English word divine. And it just shows you again the connection between a lot of these Indo-European languages, although our word divine comes from Latin. So that's the more direct connection to Sanskrit. The king of the gods in the early Veda is Indra, who's the god of thunder and storms. He's similar in that respect to the ancient Greek god Zeus or the Old Norse god Thor. The similarities in some of the Vedic gods with that of other peoples of Europe and Asia is also due to the connection between these different groups of languages, because in antiquity, especially before the spread of missionary religions, cultures that spoke similar languages also tended to have similar religions, because those are both part of a cultural package that they inherited from their ancestors. And so as languages diverged gradually, so would religions or mythologies diverge gradually, but still have some elements in common. Agni, the fire god, is fairly unique to Vedic religion. He was originally the god of the fire in the fire altar, which is the center of yagyas or Vedic sacrifices. But he became a god in his own right. So his initial significance is he carries the offerings to other gods, but he's also a god himself that is honored in many Vedic rituals. So too with Soma, the god of that mind-altering plant I mentioned earlier, which would often be given as an offering to the gods because it was believed to be something that they would enjoy consuming. But Soma also is a god in his own right. And later he became associated with Chandra, the god of the moon. He became a moon god, if you will. This is kind of a theme in the history of Hinduism or Vedic religion, is that sometimes gods of the early Veda get new associations, new interpretations, and other gods that probably originated from outside Vedic religion, like Krishna, became associated with particular gods named in the Veda. Like in the case of Krishna, he was associated with Vishnu. Surya, the sun god, is also named in many Vedic hymns. Ratri or Nisha, the goddess of the night. Ushas, goddess of the dawn, and another one is Varuna, god of cosmic order, or dharma, you might say, covenants, contracts, and later he became associated with the sea and with the ocean. This picture on the slide is an icon of the god Indra, although the way he's depicted, red skin, four arms, riding a white elephant, that is later iconography that was probably developed in the devotional bhakti or sectarian period of the first millennium AD. So he's not described as having all of those traits in the early Veda, although this depiction does show him with the Vajra or thunderbolt weapon, and that is attributed to him in the early Veda. The Veda is also the earliest reference to the Varna or caste system. There are a couple of different words that can be translated as caste. Varna is the older one. There's also Jati or birth, which refers to a more specific caste, and that's actually what people often think of when they talk about the Indian caste system is Jati, because you're meant to marry someone traditionally who has the same Jati as you. But the Varna system was that of the ancient Aryans that they probably brought with them. I don't know if we know for sure the origin of Jati, but it may have actually originated in the Indus Valley civilization or just other South Asian cultures that kind of merged with the Vedic culture, the Vedic civilization of the Aryans. Regardless, the Varnas are broader categories than the Jatis. So you could look at the Jatis as narrower subdivisions of each Varna. Most Jatis are associated with one of these four Varnas. So what are they? The Brahmins are the priests who perform the rituals honoring the gods. The Kshatriyas are warriors, nobles, rulers, kings. So they were both ones who owned most of the wealth, most of the land in the ancient Aryan civilization. They also tended to be the kings, nobles, rulers. Vaishyas are the traders, merchants, but also independent farmers who own their own land. And the Shudras is traditionally a servant caste whose members serve that of the other castes. So in Vedic religion, i.e. Hinduism, only the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, and the Vaishyas are what is known as Dvija Varna, or twice-born Varna. That means that they have the right to undergo the Upanayana initiation ceremony, which initiates men born into families from those three castes into adulthood. They prepare for the Upanayana ceremony by studying the Veda, and they have a symbolic circular string or rope that's tied around them to symbolize moving through a new portal, a new opening of a womb, if you will, symbolically, into a new life, into adulthood. After that, they can get married. They can lead Vedic ceremonies for their household, essentially. So the Shudras, they were and are participants in Vedic religion or Hinduism, but traditionally they are not allowed to perform the Upanayana ceremony. So in that way, they're kind of somewhat outside. And it's possible the historical origin of this system is that the Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas were the original three Varnas of the Aryans, and that most of the people born into the Shudra caste were those of other peoples they encountered, and that's why they weren't part of this Aryan class or caste system. The details of the evolution of this, I think, are still kind of being worked out by scholars, in particular how it became combined with Jati and transformed over time. One thing I will say is that even though endogamy or marriage within is practiced within the Jati, that also means because each Jati is associated with the Varna, traditionally Hindus also only marry someone from the same Varna. And if you look at this in terms of the modern DNA research as performed by David Reich and others, yeah, they've actually shown that Hindus have practiced endogamy or marriage within the same Jati for at least a couple thousand years. It does not appear to have been consistently practiced all the way back to the early Vedic period. So the overall picture that emerges is from around 1500 BC to, I don't know, around 500 BC in the period of Aryan civilization. That's more ancient. There were castes, there were varnas. We know that because they're described in the Veda. They're described as a deliberate creation of the supreme being, so there's a sacred authority to them. And yet we don't see such strict endogamy practice where people would only marry within the same varna as well as within the same jati or subdivision of the varna. But at some point around closer to 1 AD or the 1st century AD or BC, that's when strict endogamy became more common. So that's at least the current picture from the modern scholarship. Dharma is a word that in Hinduism means law or duty. It can refer to the moral law, it can refer to the duty of individuals, it can refer to the moral order of the cosmos, which is believed by most Hindus to be a creation of Brahman, the supreme being. People can have dharma based on the rituals of the Veda, like how you're supposed to give offerings to the gods, and also based on your caste or varna and on your ashrama or stage in life, as well as based on your sex, male or female. And neglecting dharma is described in the Veda as leading to bad consequences, both for the individual and typically others in their family, clan, community, and so on. So Hindus can also distinguish between different levels of dharma. Sanatana dharma means eternal dharma, and that's often used to describe Hindu or name Hinduism itself. It's the eternal, unchanging, divine law. Sadharana dharma means everyday dharma, and so this is the particular moral rules that people could follow on a day-to-day basis as they go about their life. There's also swa-dharma or self-dharma, and this means the dharma a person has based on their particular characteristics, including their age or life stage, ashrama, the varna or caste they're born into, and their sex, male or female. The picture on the slide is a modern, relatively recent, not that many centuries old manuscript of the Rig Veda, which is the oldest part of the Veda. Keep in mind, though, as I said before, the Veda was not written down until much longer after it was first created or composed as a text. So this Devanagari script was a later one that was adopted pretty widely in South Asia. It's often used nowadays to write Sanskrit, but it was not actually written down in this way by the ancient Aryans. The later Vedic period was from around 1100 or 1000 to around 500 BC. And this is where you see the Aryan language and culture and religion spread throughout more parts of India, especially east along the Ganges River Valley and southwards as well, as you can see on the map. Around the 500s BC and after, so this is the 6th century BC and after, you get a new phase of Vedic religion or ancient Hinduism with the composition of texts known as the Aranyakas and the Upanishads, which are regarded as later parts or layers of the Veda. These later parts of the Veda focus on the inner meaning of Vedic sacrifice, where the sacrifice of an animal, for example, or something else valuable, is interpreted spiritually as the sacrifice a wise person makes of their self and all of their material attachments to the divine, to the supreme being, Brahman, about which more later. So in this later Vedic period, there are still Vedic rituals being practiced with offerings to the devas put into the fire altar. That never leaves Hinduism. That is still a part of modern Hinduism today. But you get these new ideas about a secret or hidden spiritual knowledge, jnana, that is regarded as of greater significance in terms of the salvation or the enlightenment or the liberation, the moksha of an individual soul. The Upanishads are one of these texts developed in the later Vedic period, and they add a bunch of new beliefs that are not seen, at least not in this developed form, in the earlier part of the Veda, such as the Rig Veda, for example. But these are a huge fundamental part of Hinduism today. So, belief in samsara, the cycle of life, death, and reincarnation or rebirth of all living, or maybe only all sentient conscious beings. Karma, the idea that how you are reborn, what type of body you're reborn into, what type of life, what realm or level of existence you can be reborn into, because you could be reborn in a heaven, you could be reborn in a hell realm or a place of suffering, you could be reborn as an animal, as a human of potentially another varna, another sex, and so on. All of these circumstances of rebirth are influenced by your karma, your past action. Karma or action can also influence what you experience within a given life as well. So there's actually three main time scales at which the fruit or consequence of karma operates. Right when you perform the action, whether good or bad, later in the same life, and in your future lives. So the usual view of samsara within Hinduism, and this is also true of Jainism and Buddhism as well, is that even though there's a type of, you could say, eternity to it, because you keep on living, your soul, your consciousness continues, it's not regarded as a good circumstance, a good state of affairs. Because each of these lives, each of these incarnations, even if you're born into a relatively privileged life, such as that of a heavenly being, or a king, or a priest with great authority or wealth, there's still going to be suffering, there's still going to be loss, there's still going to be death. Everything you have in that life, you're eventually going to lose because the life will end at some point. And there's going to be separation. And also, you're limited insofar as you're limited to one body, one form. So samsara is not thought of as a good thing, even though it has a kind of everlastingness to it. It's thought of as just a succession of sufferings, losses, deaths, confinements into one form, imprisonments. So it's looked at as a trap for the soul. And the goal of the Upanishads, this later part of the Veda, is moksha, which means liberation or freedom. So this is attained through knowledge of the true self, Atman, and of the supreme being, Brahman. And when you perfect that knowledge, you can basically transcend karma, you will transcend reincarnation, you will attain union with the true self and with the supreme being, about which more later. The Upanishads also teach the method of asceticism or renunciation, giving up material goods, giving up attachments, giving up wealth, fame, power, things of that nature, all worldly things. So this is what is needed as far as a practice, another type of sacrifice in order to get that supreme spiritual knowledge that helps you attain moksha. So a word for this in Sanskrit is tapas, which can be translated as austerities or renunciation, giving things up. So it's regarded as a more profound, a more pure perhaps, or spiritual form of sacrifice that sort of goes beyond the ritual sacrifice of the early Veda. And this is something discussed in the Upanishads. They don't deny the effectiveness of Vedic sacrifice. In other words, if you give certain things to the devas, the gods, they will bless you in return. But all of that is happening within samsara. And the goal of the Upanishads is to transcend samsara. So they advocate preferentially this other type of sacrifice, of tapas. It could include things like renouncing sex, wealth, family, or comforts, practicing yoga, which can have different meanings, but it can mean just meditation or a type of spiritual discipline for long periods of time, including hours, days, or weeks. And the idea is that self-discipline and renunciation are a necessary condition for attaining that freedom, that moksha, that spiritual release. Brahmacharya means the supreme sacrifice, and this refers to giving up sex or the practice of celibacy. The people who live an ascetic lifestyle for long periods are known as shramanas, which literally means a striver. And in the 500s BC, around that period, probably a little bit before as well, there were many different groups of shamanas that were in the Ganges River Valley in India. And not all of them were Hindu. Not all of them, in other words, practiced Vedic religion or acknowledged the authority of the Brahmins. These non-Vedic groups of shamans, they founded other religions like Jainism, Buddhism, and the Ajivikas, who died out, but they were a prominent sect in ancient times. So from around the 500s or 6th century BC, you get organized orders of monks and nuns in Jainism and in Buddhism. So these religions did have an influence on Hinduism. The influence may have been mutual, but the Jains appear to have been the oldest ones who set up a systematic rule of practicing asceticism and who authored these texts that tell you how to attain their version of moksha. So there were similar beliefs in the Jain, the Buddhists, and the Hindus who authored the Upanishads in terms of karma, samsara, and moksha, but they had different theologies, different metaphysical theories of the nature of the self and reality, and different soteriologies or theories of salvation, different theories of how exactly to attain the moksha. So that's why they really were separate sects and evolved into different religions despite their commonalities. Now, on the one hand, the Hindu orders of monks that were modeled primarily after those of the Buddhists, in all probability, those were not formed until over 1,000 years after the period in which the Upanishads were written. So not until the 8th to 9th centuries AD, after the later Hindu philosopher Shankara instituted the Dasanamis order of Hindu monks. But these would be monks that had a specific habit or way of dress, had a specific code of vows that they had to follow. But the Hindu ascetics were quite old, perhaps as old as the Jains or Buddhists, maybe even a little bit older. The origins of this period is a little bit murky, but probably around the period that the Jains started, if not earlier, there were also Hindu shamans or strivers who had a similar goal to the Jains of moksha, transcending karma, transcending samsara, but unlike the Jains, the Hindu shamans, they recognized the authority of the Veda. They still believed in the Vedic gods, in Brahman, the supreme being described in the Veda. And so you can see these groups emerge around the same period, 500s BC, and then go on, evolve in their own separate ways. There are still Hindu shamans today. They are more often called sannyasins, which is another name for a renunciate. You can see an example of one in the picture here. And it's common for Hindu sannyasins to wear saffron or orange colored robes, as you can see in this example. Darshanas are systems of Hindu philosophy, and they also trace back to this late Vedic period, really around the 500s BC and after. The oldest of them is probably Sankhya, and they kind of developed in the several centuries between 500 BC to the first century or early centuries AD is when they continue to develop, especially later on with the various systems of Vedanta. So these are all Hindu, but they have different beliefs, different theologies, different philosophies. So there is diversity, there's debate within Hinduism. What they have in common is they all believe in the Veda, but otherwise they can disagree with each other. For example, about the nature of the gods or of the supreme being or of how to attain moksha. So they also developed their doctrines in part not just debating each other, but debating non-Hindu sects and schools, like the various schools of ancient Buddhist philosophy that were prominent in India at that time. Later on, incidentally, Buddhism mostly died out in India, but that wasn't until after 1000 AD or so. So there are many different schools of darshana. The main ones are listed on the slide. Sankhya is probably the oldest, probably goes back to at least the 500s BC. The meaning of the term Sankhya is separation, discrimination or analysis. And what it's referring to is being able to separate or tell the difference between the true self and everything else. So it's about self-knowledge. And by self, they mean your true inner nature, not what most of us regard as our self, which they claim is a false or illusory self. So Sankhya, like many other forms of Hinduism, regards the true self as pure consciousness. Pure consciousness. Consciousness with no object, that's only aware of itself as conscious. And everything else, not only including what we ordinarily think of as physical objects or material bodies, but even other types of awareness or subjective experience, like individual emotions or memories or thoughts. Those things are not your true self. They should be let go of. And when you discover your true self, then you can become liberated. You can attain moksha. The yoga school is also pretty ancient. It focuses on meditation. So that was the original focus of the yoga school of philosophy or darshana. And later forms of yoga like hatha yoga or forceful yoga focus not only on meditation but on controlling the breath, breathing in various ways to help facilitate meditation. But meditation or focusing on one object for a long period of time is believed to enable a person to see their true self and thus to attain union with God. Yoga is a theistic school of philosophy. So they believe in a single supreme being, even though, like most other Hindus, they also believe in other lesser gods as well. That would be creations or manifestations of the supreme being. And it's common in more modern forms of yoga to also put a lot of emphasis on physical posture. Now, this does go back to antiquity. There are ancient accounts of Hindu yogis or other ascetics standing or adopting other postures, where they put their limbs in a particular configuration and hold it for hours and typically meditate while they're doing so. So the stable posture is believed to facilitate the meditation practice that which, when perfected, leads to moksha. But modern forms of yoga especially focus on the postures, and some develop it into a type of gymnastics or fitness routine. Mimamsa is a type of darshana that focuses on Vedic ritual. And they're kind of interesting because they're sometimes interpreted as atheistic in that they don't necessarily think that the devas, the gods of the Veda, have independent existence, but rather the rituals are the fundamental powers or realities. And the divine beings named in the rituals might be kind of manifestations or intermediaries of the power of the ritual of the Veda itself. Vedanta is schools of philosophy based on the Upanishads. So they take the scriptures in the Upanishads, the later parts of the Veda, and develop systematic philosophies and theologies based on them. Nyaya is a type of Hindu philosophy that focused on logic and epistemology or theory of knowledge. And Vaisheshika originally was a comprehensive philosophical system, but came to mainly be reduced to its metaphysical theory, which is based on small atoms. And oftentimes it became combined later on with Nyaya. So Nyaya, logic and epistemology, would be combined with Vaisheshika atomistic metaphysics. This is fairly common among darshans. Another example is nowadays Sankhya doesn't really survive on its own. It's usually combined with yoga for the Sankhya yoga school, which accepts the Sankhya analysis of consciousness and matter, but combines it with yoga practices and their theism. So there are three main types of Vedanta. Even though the Upanishads are much more ancient, they date back to the 500s BC, the earlier ones do in any event, the systems of philosophy Vedanta developed based on them are from much later, from the 8th to 9th centuries and on. So Shankara is generally regarded as the main founder or compiler of Advaita or non-dual Vedanta. According to this philosophy, there's only one true being, Brahman, the supreme being, and everything else is just a manifestation of Brahman, so it lacks independent existence, and if you believe they are real, that's a form of Maya or illusion, and that's what keeps your consciousness rather, trapped in samsara. And this is because in the Upanishads, many of the passages have this very monistic or non-dualistic connotation where they suggest Brahman is the only real being. Vishishtadvaita Vedanta was developed later by Ramanuja, and Ramanuja attempts to compromise. So he accepts the non-dualism that is apparent in the Upanishads. So he regards Brahman, or the Supreme Being, as the only ultimate substance or independently existing being. But he does believe there are real, metaphysically real distinctions within Brahman. So this is called qualified or vishisht non-dualism, Advaita. And one way of thinking about this is that different individual persons or souls or different material objects, they're not true beings, they're not substances, we might say, that can exist independent of Brahman, but they are attributes or aspects of Brahman. So this is just an analogy. It's somewhat deceptive, but you can compare this to a part-whole relation. So for example, your hand and your foot are different parts of your body. They have a real distinction between them because the hand has properties that the foot does not have and vice versa, and yet they cannot continue to exist when separated from your body. So they're not true substances or beings in their own right. And finally, the third main type of Vedanta is Dvaita, developed by Madhva in the 13th century AD. And this is the dualistic Vedanta, which accepts more the common sense view of a real and fundamental metaphysical distinction between the creator, Brahman, the supreme being, and the various aspects of the creation, which according to Madhva and most other dualistic systems of Hindu religion, there are two types of created beings. Souls, those are the things that are stuck in samsara and have consciousness, and matter, which includes all types of material objects. And both souls and matter are created, and so they are different, according to Madhva, from the creator, the supreme being, Brahman. They are created substances, we might say, using that term from Western philosophy, because they are distinct beings in their own right. They're not just attributes or aspects of Brahman, although in some sense they depend on Brahman for their creation and thus for their existence. But they do have a separate reality. And Madhva's version of Vedanta is also quite influential. Probably most modern Hindus adhere to dualistic sects of Hinduism that accept the theology and metaphysics of Madhva's Dvaita Vedanta, but there are also non-dualist and qualified non-dualists too who still exist within Hinduism. So around the first millennium AD, this is a period over several centuries, you get what's called sectarian Hinduism or sectarian worship, puja, develop. This is a new way of practicing Hinduism or Vedic religion. And it's focused on worshiping a particular god or goddess or sometimes a family or a small group of related gods, and using new rituals than those described in the early Veda, using sometimes new gods with different names and profiles or personalities. The people, the Hindus who practice these forms of sectarian worship, which is the most common form of Hindu worship today, they still acknowledge the Veda, and they will still also sometimes sponsor Vedic sacrifices performed by Brahmins. So the Veda has not been thrown aside, but rather it's been incorporated with this new form of worship, which focuses on puja, which can mean worship or prayer, rather than yajna or sacrifice in accordance with the Veda. So puja is often connected to bhakti, which means love, devotion, or commitment, typically to a god or goddess. And the idea is you develop a personal, intimate, very emotional relationship with the god or goddess who can facilitate your salvation, can facilitate your eventually attaining liberation or moksha. So often the sectarian Hinduism, it has beliefs and goals similar to the Upanishads, where there's karma, there's samsara or reincarnation. The goal is to attain moksha, but the way to do so is through devotion to a personal god rather than renunciation. And in Hinduism, when people talk about Hindu theism or belief in one god, So theism, the word is somewhat ambiguous, but when used alone, it can refer to monotheism, belief in one God. Most Hindus are technically polytheistic, they believe in many gods, but most are also theists who believe one God is supreme, or Brahman. The literal meaning of Brahman is the supreme being, supreme thing. And that god or goddess is the one that is often worshipped by a particular sect and is regarded as the creator of the other gods, the devas, and the goddesses, the devis, and also creator of the universe and human souls and so on. So you can start to see here the diversity, the kind of richness and complexity of Hindu theologies. And also there's just many different sects of Hindus who might worship Vishnu as the supreme being, or Shiva as the supreme being, or a goddess as the supreme being. So in the period of sectarian Hinduism, you also get new scriptures. This is after the Veda. The Upanishads, which we mentioned earlier, are considered later parts or layers of the Veda, but they're still considered divinely authored or Shruti. These later scriptures are called Smriti, which means they're historical. They are remembered from the past. So they have human authors, although they're generally also believed to be divinely inspired. So one type of Smriti scripture is the Itihasa, which means history, and this refers to epics, Ramayana, Mahabharata, that have tales of gods and heroes, about which more later. The Puranas are devotional texts that are usually devoted to one god or goddess. So they're connected to that rise of sectarian Hinduism in the first millennium AD. They also describe how to perform ritual worship in temples, which is generally separate in terms of its form from the Vedic fire altar worship. Although Hindu temples do sometimes have permanently erected fire altars as well for the Vedic ceremonies, but the temple ceremonies would generally focus on giving offerings on an altar before an image or murti of a god or goddess, as opposed to putting offerings in a fire. The devotional poetry is different from the older Vedic chants, so it was often composed by saints or other people under divine inspiration. So these can be sung as bhajans or devotional songs, and many of them are in Sanskrit, which was the language of the Veda, but some are in Tamil, a South Indian language not related to Sanskrit, or in other languages as well. And another important scripture from this later period is the Bhagavad Gita. It's part of the Mahabharata, although it's also regarded as Shruti or revealed, so it has the honorary status of an Upanishad as well. And the Bhagavad Gita expresses some new doctrines. It tries to synthesize many different aspects of Hinduism, both worshiping Krishna as a supreme savior god, beliefs in the Upanishads of samsara, karma, moksha, but also trying to connect it with people's duty based on their varna or caste, as described in other, including earlier parts of the Veda as well. So its main innovation, apart from the synthesis, is depicting devotion to a personal god as itself being a means to moksha. So it takes the goal of the Upanishads of moksha, but says you don't have to live as a sannyasin, as a renunciate. You could attain moksha as a householder, someone with a family or a job, as long as you have sufficient love and devotion to Krishna as your personal God, your personal savior. The Bhagavad Gita, the dating is disputed, but perhaps it comes from around the 200s BC. So in other words, it's an early example of this sectarian form of Hinduism that develops into greater maturity in the first millennium AD. The picture on the slide is a small painting from a manuscript on palm leaf of one of the Puranas dedicated to the god Vishnu, who's shown in blue with 4 arms in the center of the painting. And Vaishnava means it's a sect of Hinduism devoted to the god Vishnu. Temples were a big part of the rise of sectarian Hinduism. So the ancient Hindus, those who practiced the early Vedic worship, they did not always do so in temples or shrines. There is some archaeology that I've read about from India from around the period of 500 BC or so of wooden shrines, wooden structures. Um, it's not always clear. It doesn't seem like that was connected to the Vedic ceremonies so much. But the Vedic ceremonies, if you think about them, you put offerings into a fire, and that fire, it's constructed in a particular way, but it can be performed anywhere. And that's probably connected to the fact that the ancient Aryans were nomadic, and so they would take the altars with them as they roamed across the countryside. But later in Hinduism, connected to the rise of sectarian worship, you get larger, including permanent stone temple structures built. And these house the altars, these house the images or icons of the gods and goddesses, and the temple rituals are performed there. The offerings are often given there. And the period of the first millennium AD saw the construction of very large stone temples, and these were often patronized by kings. They did it for a couple of reasons. One, to show off their wealth, to show off their power, to kind of legitimize their rule. Two, to gain merit or good karma. So the belief, and this is shared by other South Asian religions like Buddhism and Jainism, is that in order to have a good rebirth and also to help facilitate your eventual experience of moksha or nirvana, as the case may be, the state of salvation, you might say, or enlightenment, you will gain merit and facilitate this process by giving away wealth to the religion. So this is regarded as an act of great merit whenever a king would commission a new temple to be built. And there's also aspects of the development of Hindu monarchy that are reflected by some of the beliefs of these gods, like Vishnu and his incarnations, like Rama, are often regarded as ideal kings. So they create an age of dharma, an age of justice in the world. So they become role models for Hindu kings as well. So there's often a close relationship in the first millennium AD between kingship and the rise and development of these sectarian forms of Hinduism. There are three main sects or subdivisions of devotional Hinduism or sectarian Hinduism. I'm using those terms somewhat interchangeably. These are the types of Hinduism that are focused on bhakti or devotion and that tend to take place in temples and that tend to be sectarian, i.e. devoted primarily to a particular god and goddess. The three main types or subdivisions are Vaishnavas, dedicated to the god Vishnu, Shaivas, dedicated to the god Shiva, and Shaktas, dedicated to a particular goddess or Devi, such as Durga or Kali. There are others as well. So each of these have numerous particular sects and lineages within them. For example, some Vaishnavas trace their lineage to Mirabai, who was a medieval saint of Vishnu, who was a woman. Oftentimes in Hinduism, the word saint is applied to someone who is believed to have been enlightened or liberated, having attained moksha when they were still alive. So they have a kind of union with the divine, and so that gives them the kind of inspiration and the authority to teach others. In this modern picture of Mirabai, in the background is shown an image of Krishna, who is generally regarded by Hindus as an avatar or incarnation of Vishnu. So Krishna is revered by many Vaishnava Hindus, and here he's depicted playing his flute. So after the period of the rise of devotional and sectarian Hinduism, there was a period of Muslim conquest and domination. The Muslim armies actually migrated into India through the Khyber Pass in the Hindu Kush Mountains in what's now Afghanistan, still a very strategic location. This is basically a pass through those very high mountains to the northwest of India that enables foreign groups to navigate a path through the mountains more effectively. And so the Muslim armies, they had different ethnicities, some related to Turks, some related to other ethnicities in Afghanistan, or what's now Afghanistan. But what they had in common is that they were Muslims, and the kingdoms and empires that they founded which are collectively called the Delhi Sultanate in the first phase, these had Muslim rulers, and so they tended to promote Islam over Hinduism. The Delhi Sultanate is not just one dynasty, it was a succession of dynasties that were all based in the city of Delhi in the north. So that's in the Ganges River Valley area. And the map shows one particular of those dynasties, the Tughlaq dynasty, which had its height between 1330 and 1355. After the Delhi Sultanate was the Mughal Empire. So this controlled, at its height, most of South Asia. And it's dated from 1526 to 1857, but in the later period, especially in the 17 and 1800s, the European country of Great Britain, or the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, as it was then known, was able to control a lot of India, and gradually they incorporated all of India into the British Empire, and that spelled the final demise of the Mughal dynasty. But it was happening even before that date of 1857. So Hindus today look back on this period of Muslim dynasties as one of colonialism or imperialism. They regard themselves as having experienced two main waves of imperialism. The first was under these Muslim dynasties, and the second was under the British in the 1718 and early 1900s. Now, during the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire, there were a lot of conversions to Islam, especially in the northwest along the Indus River Valley, and in the northeast in the lower part of the Ganges River at the upper part of the Bay of Bengal. So there were other Muslim converts as well. You get a lot of cities that have mixed Hindu and Muslim populations. Despite the large number of conversions to Islam, some of them coerced, most Indians did remain Hindu. And there were different periods of either cooperation or conflict. So it would kind of depend on who was in charge and what their kind of philosophy of ruling was. So Akbar the Great was one of the most famous of the Mughal emperors, and he's also famous for having encouraged religious toleration and dialogue between Muslims, Hindus, and other religions. But there were also periods of conflict and where the Muslim rulers would try to oppress Hindus. And in general, a lot of the conflict between Hindus and Muslims today in South Asia, you could say, is rooted in this period of foreign Muslim domination of the subcontinent. But there were also cooperation and mutual learning and influence between Hinduism and Islam. You can see this in the Nirgun Bhakti movement, or devotion to the supreme being Brahman, Nirguna, without form, without features, without tangible characteristics, which developed in the Delhi Sultanate and in the Mughal period, especially in northern India. And so a lot of the people that were part of this movement, they identified neither as Muslim nor as Hindu. And that was true of both Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism, and of Kabir. Kabir nowadays is often regarded as a saint or liberated, enlightened being by a lot of Hindus, but he did not identify as a Hindu, and it's generally thought he was born into a Muslim family. But what these people had in common is they were influenced by the Muslim idea of a transcendent God who it would be sacrilegious to worship as an image, as an icon. Islam, it differs from Christianity, for example, or some forms of Christianity, in that Islam does not permit the use of icons or images. And that was a huge difference between Islam and Hinduism, where the sectarian Hinduism is all about leaving offerings to images of gods or goddesses on altars at temples. So Nirguna Bhakti tries to harmonize Hinduism and Islam by having a single supreme being called Brahman, or God, who is not shown or depicted in an image, is believed to fully transcend all material forms, But many people in this movement also took the ideas from Hinduism of karma, samsara, and moksha, try to combine the two. And there still are some Hindus who have that approach to their religion today. After the Mughals had started to decline, there were a bunch of European powers who came to India. They actually had come even before that in the 1400s, the Portuguese. But the Portuguese were mainly interested in trade, so they did found a few small colonies in port cities, mainly so that they could secure their merchants and their depots of goods, because at that time it was very profitable for Europeans to trade with India things that they could not acquire in Europe. But after the Portuguese, there came the Dutch, the French, and the British, and there were eventually conflicts for control over the trade with India. By the 1700s, the main conflict was between France and Britain. Britain won, and after that, they were gradually able to take over all of India. This is a map of the British East Indian Empire at its greatest extent in the 1800s. For much of the British colonial period, it was not actually the British Parliament or king who ruled India, but rather a private corporation called the British East India Company. After a mutiny or rebellion in the 1800s called the Sepoy Mutiny or the Indian Rebellion, the British government took over the control of India directly, and this is called the British Raj, or direct rule by Britain. During this period, Indians were exposed to a lot of Western ideas, such as modern science, Western forms of philosophy, and religion, including Christianity. There were some converts to Christianity during the British period, such as, especially in eastern Bengal and the eastern hill country, some Protestant converts. Earlier on, in some of the Portuguese colonies, there were converts to Catholic Christianity. And incidentally, there are ancient Christian churches in India as well, the so-called Thomas churches that were believed to have been founded by the Apostle Thomas when he traveled to India in antiquity. So there's at least three main types of Christians that exist in India: the ancient churches, the Catholics brought by the Portuguese, and the various Protestant churches brought during the period of British rule primarily. But the vast majority of Indians remained Hindu or Muslim. They did not convert to Christianity during British rule. So a lot happened in Hinduism during the period of British colonial rule in response to the new ideas they got from the West, and also just in response to being dominated by a Western power, simultaneously wanting to throw off those imperial shackles, but also to learn and adapt select features from Western societies, like modern science and technology, for example. So this led to a series of Hindu reform movements in the 19th century. Some of these were influenced by Protestant Christianity, i.e. British religion. Others were influenced by the Enlightenment, so this period of science, rationality, of the belief in material progress, of political liberalism, earlier forms of social justice, the idea that all people should have equal rights. These ideas flowed into India in the 1800s, just as they were flowing through the Western world generally. So one of the Hindu reformers shown in the picture, Ram Mohan Roy, very influential. Another, Dayananda Saraswati. Later on in the 19th century, Vivekananda. His significance is that he actually presented a kind of modernized form of the Advaita Vedanta philosophy of Hinduism and brought it to the West. He also was one of the first people to teach Westerners modern yoga, and so he helped spread yoga to the West as well. So many of these Hindu reformers sought to restore what they perceived as the glory of the Hindu past, but they often sought to modernize or reinterpret some traditional forms of Hinduism, such as suggesting, under the influence of Protestant Christianity, that all Hindus, not just Brahmins or priests, should read the Veda, should read the scriptures, or suggesting, under the influence perhaps of both Christianity and Islam, that Hindus should not worship idols or icons. They should only have iconic rituals or sacrifices to honor the gods. There are a bunch of different reforms proposed. Most of these reforms kind of died out. Nowadays, actually more traditional forms of Hinduism, generally a sectarian Hinduism, are most popular, and there's even been an attempt to revive some of the older traditions that were regarded as archaic, passé, or primitive during this period of European influence in the 1800s. But nevertheless, the legacy of the Hindu reform movements remains because they helped construct a modern Hindu identity. They helped create a common sense of Hinduness or Hindutva by the various sects of Hindus as a way of unifying themselves culturally and religiously as distinct from Islam or Christianity. There was also a kind of Hindu cultural literary renaissance during this time. There were Western educated journalists and authors and politicians, and this all helped fuel the rise of Indian nationalism and the Swarajya or self-rule movement. So people in India seeking to become independent of the British Empire. Eventually, independence from Britain was achieved in 1947 after the Second World War, although this led to the partition or splitting of British India between primarily the nations of India, which is majority Hindu, and Pakistan, which is majority Muslim. During the period of Indian independence, the leaders among the politicians were often educated in the West or in Western-run schools in India. So they're often English literate. They are familiar with Western science, Western political ideology, including various forms of Marxism and socialism, which were trendy at the time. So the first president of independent India was Jawaharlal Nehru, and the author of the Constitution was B.R. Ambedkar. Ambedkar was actually born into the untouchable caste or Dalit. So this is a fifth Varna, which is regarded as less pure than the others. But he was recognized early on as being very intelligent, so he was adopted by a Brahmin man surnamed Ambedkar, who gave him his surname so that he would face less discrimination from other Hindus as he attempted to gain an education. So these elites, they tended to be very westernized, even though they were big advocates of India becoming independent of Britain and thus politically independent of the West. Their education was for the most part in Western universities. So they were often socialists, which was a very influential European ideology at the time. I mean, it still is in a lot of ways in educated circles in the West. And they tended to be secularists, either not religious, or if they were religious, they sought to make a secular state which did not favor Hinduism over other religions, even though it was by far the majority religion in India. They did recognize the great diversity of religions in India, even after partition, where most of the Muslims in South Asia became part of the nation of Pakistan. There was still a large number of Muslims and other religions too in India, like Christianity, Jainism, some Buddhists, Sikhs, and many others. And so they sought to make, through the Constitution and through law, religious freedom, a secular government in India, not trying to enforce the Hindu identity on everyone. Primarily, they were interested in social justice, trying to make India a socialist place in which the people who were poor and of lower castes would have better material opportunities. So Hindutva is a very popular ideology in India today. It's been around for a century or more. The literal meaning is something like Hinduness. It's a term for Hindu nationalism, including the idea that all people in the modern nation of India should either be Hindu or acknowledge their cultural identity as connected to the Hindu religion. It has its roots over 100 years ago, really, in the independence, the Swarajya movement. And there were Hindutva activists in the period towards the end of British rule and the early period of independence, but the Congress Party, which was more associated with the Western educated, more secular and socialist elites, was the initial party to gain political power in 1947 with Indian independence and for several generations thereafter. It's only been in the last few decades that Hindutva and political parties associated with it, such as the BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party, have grown in power and prominence. And there's many different parties and organizations associated with Hindutva. One of them is the RSS, which is a paramilitary organization. The whole group or network of these organizations is called Sangh Parivar, which is the family of organizations sharing the Hindutva ideology. So this is controversial, especially among Western scholars who tend to not like Hindutva. They regard it as chauvinistic, as nationalistic. But from the perspective of Hindutva people itself and many just modern Indians, modern Hindus, they would look upon it more favorably as a movement trying to create a unified Indian national identity and consciousness, and thus to help unite the nation, help make it more cooperative, and to kind of assert its place in the world. For a long time, India was under the shadow of these foreign empires and dynasties. First the Muslim ones, then the British, and even after independence, just as they were developing economically, under the kind of shadow of the Anglo-American cultural dominance you see with like even today with the United States has influence all over the world. And so a lot of people, I think, in India support Hindutva as well because they wish India to have the freedom to kind of chart their own way in the world. But on the flip side, it's sometimes connected with violence against people of other religions like Buddhists, Muslims, or Christians, for example. So that leads to the example of the Babri Mosque, which was built by the Mughals, and Hindus believe it was built on the site of the birthplace of the king Rama, who they believe is an avatar or incarnation of the god Vishnu. So for Hindus, the Babri Mosque was a symbol of Muslim imperialism. So this place in Ayodhya in northern India was believed to be one of the most sacred places in the religion, and these Muslim emperors built a mosque on it. And so it was very controversial among Hindus. The mosque was destroyed, was torn down by a Hindu nationalist mob in 1992. So it was torn down extrajudiciously outside the law, so technically a crime, although a lot of Hindus approved of it. And since then, a temple, Ram Mandir, has been built on the site of the former mosque. And that temple, as the name implies, honors Rama, the incarnation of Vishnu. There have been other outbreaks of violence between Hindus and Muslims. One connected with Ram Mandir temple in Ayodhya was the Godhra train burning in 2002. So on their way back from a pilgrimage to Ram Mandir, a bunch of Hindu pilgrims died in a fire on a train. And the cause of the fire, I don't think it's completely known, but many people blamed it on Muslims deliberately setting it to hurt these Hindu pilgrims. And so there were a lot of riots and deaths of both Muslims and Hindus during this period. Now let's talk a bit more about Western scholars' views of Hindutva. This is a very controversial topic. The textbook kind of shies away from it, except for this one paragraph that I quote here. But I think it is worth talking about because it is so important. It's very controversial, but it's the sort of thing that really needs to be talked about at least a little bit. So there's a huge clash of perspective, I would say, from that of most Hindus, both in India and in the Indian diaspora, like Hindu migrants to other countries like United States or Canada, North America, for example, and Western scholars. So most Western scholars, they tend to be very into globalism. They tend to be very multicultural. They tend to support secular government. They tend to support religious and other forms of pluralism and diversity. And so they tend to look at Hindutva negatively as something that's chauvinistic, biased against non-Hindus, nationalistic, can lead to ethnic, religious, national conflicts, etc., etc. So even though a lot of Western scholars kind of pride themselves on their open-mindedness, their support for diversity, like ethnically and religiously, I think this is an example that shows you the kind of limitations of the Western openness to diversity, because many Western scholars are not open to certain types of ideological diversity, especially those connected to traditional religion or nationalism, or in this case, both. So Maya Warrior is the author of this chapter in the textbook, and let's look at a quote that she has about Hindutva. Quote, "Yet many Hindus are not greatly concerned, as Hinduness is not something they explicitly think about. Running counter to these chauvinist and violently exclusivist forms of Hinduism, other forms of Hindu belief and practice adopt a more inclusive, universal orientation, emphasizing values such as social justice, peace, and the spiritual transformation of humanity, though Hinduism has, in fact, always been inclusive, encompassing many traditions and practices. Some recent manifestations of Hinduism, especially in the form of Indian gurus addressing Western and/or multicultural audiences, have transcended nationalistic boundaries in their teaching and philosophy," unquote. And this is from A Short Introduction to World Religions, page 77. So a couple things I'll note about this quotation. Notice the way Warrior describes Hinduness or Hindutva: chauvinist, violently exclusivist. These are very negative descriptions. So you can really see and kind of feel, and I think it's very typical or representative of how most Western scholars would view Hindutva. I also have another example of a Western scholar on the slide, Wendy Doniger. She's been very controversial, not just because she's not a fan of Hindutva, but also because she's criticized a lot of Hindus' own self-understanding of their history, as frankly I do in this video as well, with my support for the Aryan migration model of Indian history and all that sort of thing. So I too would be regarded by a lot of Hindus as a chauvinistic Western scholar who just imposes my own ideas and doesn't respect Hindu narratives, that sort of thing. I think we have to take a more balanced or nuanced perspective. So we shouldn't just assume that every Hindu narrative, every self-understanding is true, regardless if we have scientific evidence or historical or archaeological evidence that conflicts with it. But at the same time, we should try to understand modern Hinduism from their own perspective, and Hindutva from the perspective of those who support it. I think it is very biased, very Western, ironically very chauvinist, to just paint all Hindutva with this simplistic brush of chauvinism or of violent exclusivism. And you also note that in Warrior's description of Hinduism, she advocates openly this more inclusive, universal orientation, social justice, peace. In a way, this is imposing the values of the modern Western educated elite on modern Hindus. And it's funny because I think as Western scholars, we are often blind to this kind of dynamic. It's a subtle way in which we are still often imposing our values, trying to do a type of cultural imperialism on Hindus or people from other countries for that matter. So it's just something to be aware of. It's a big topic we can't fully address here, but we should, I think, even as outsiders, try to understand why Hindutva is appealing, what it means to a lot of Hindus, why a lot of Hindus support it, and try to recognize possible good aspects of it, not just criticize it from our perspective. It's okay if at the end of the day, after an objective analysis, we find aspects that are worthy of critique, but it's good to try to at least understand it on its own terms before stooping to this level of a very harsh critique that doesn't really give it its fair due. So what about Hinduism outside of India? In antiquity, Hinduism actually did spread into other parts of Asia, mainly Southeast Asia and into the East Indies. So the modern nations of Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. Now, most of those areas are now Buddhist or Muslim, but there are small pockets of Hinduism that survive. For example, on the islands of Java and Bali in Indonesia. In the picture is Hindu puja or worship being performed in Bali by local people. There also has been spread of Hinduism in modern times, primarily the 18 and 1900s and 21st century. There were two main phases of this spread of Hinduism outside of India. First, during the period of the British Empire, where a lot of Indians, including both Muslims and Hindus, migrated to other parts of the British Empire. And they were occasionally or often encouraged to do so by the British because these Indians, many of whom were from the educated castes, performed various functions in other British colonies, like in Guyana on the north coast of South America, in South Africa, and in Malaysia. And so they might work as merchants or as administrators in the colonial governments there. The second main wave of Hindu migration outside of India was after the Second World War, especially in more recent decades, where many have migrated to various countries, including US and Canada, North America, also to the United Kingdom and elsewhere. So it's very common for Hindus in the diaspora actually to support Hindutva and Hindu nationalism, and they often regard India as the sacred heart or homeland of their religion. So they're still often quite connected to the nation of India. Chapter 14, Sacred Writings. This is an overview of the main types of Hindu scriptures, and then we'll go into a bit more detail about each type. So there's many types of scriptures in Hinduism. The earliest, the Veda, as we mentioned, date from around 1500 BC. The latest have been authored up until almost modern times. The two main types of scriptures are Shruti, or heard, and Smriti, or remembered. The heard Shruti scriptures are revealed by Brahman, or God, to ancient seers or sages, rishis. They consist primarily of the Veda, including the later Veda, which is the Upanishads, and the Bhagavad Gita, which, though it's a part of the epic Mahabharata, it's treated as Shruti because it's believed to be a revelation from the god Krishna. Smriti texts are remembered, are not directly divinely authored, but are still regarded as authoritative. The three main types of Smriti texts are the Itihasa, or epics, the Dharma Sutras, and the Puranas. Dharma Sutras are about law, moral rules for different people based on their caste, gender, and stage in life. The Puranas are devotional texts dedicated to gods, avatars, and temple worship. Most of these scriptures are in Sanskrit, the original classical language of the Veda, brought by the Aryans to South Asia. Sanskrit is the refined or formalized version of the language as it was spoken in the early Vedic period. It became the language of scholarship, of religion, of philosophy for India, and it's still used today in liturgy. But there's also scriptures and religious literature in other languages, such as the southern language of Tamil, which is not related to Sanskrit. There are some Puranas, for example, in Tamil. Occasionally you see variants of the original text. So for example, there's a version of the epic Ramayana called the Adhyatma Ramayana, which stresses the bhakti or devotion aspect of Hinduism. So the idea that the way to attain salvation is through devotion to God. The picture on the slide is just from a manuscript of the Bhagavad Gita, and it shows Arjuna, the Pandava hero from the Mahabharata, in his chariot along with the god Krishna. So let's look at the Veda. This is really what unites all Hindus, is the acknowledgement of the authority of this scripture. It does come from the word vid in Sanskrit, meaning knowledge. And there are different, there's four Vedas, the Rig, Sama, Yajur, and Atharva. The Rig is the oldest, the Atharva is the youngest. But in addition to the four Vedas, each Veda has four parts or layers. The Samhita is the original text. So you could think of the four Vedas, their Samhita, as being the Veda proper. but there are additional commentaries and interpretations of each of the four Vedas, Samhitas, that were authored in later centuries, including the Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and the Upanishads. The picture on the right is just from a later manuscript of the Atharva Veda Samhita. So the Samhitas include things like hymns of praise to Indra and the gods, as seen in the Rig Veda. And there's also shorter chants and mantras that could be performed by other priests in Vedic ceremonies. The Atharva Veda has mantras and even magic spells that could do things like heal a person, find out information. Also, the Atharva Veda would be used by the presiding priest, the Brahman, to correct errors in a ritual in real time in order to preserve its integrity. In the picture is a Brahmin who's teaching the Veda to young Brahmin boys, basically teaching them to recite it and correcting them should they get anything wrong. So the Veda is still transmitted orally to this day, even though there's also written versions of it available. The Brahmanas are the interpreted texts or commentaries on the Veda, the original Samhita. So Brahmanas basically means for the Brahmins or for the priests. So they include details of how to actually perform the rituals, the yagyas, and explains their meaning or significance. The Veda Samhita actually would include like hymns or chants, for example, but it wouldn't give you the actual behaviors involved or how to perform the ritual. So for example, in the fire ritual with the fire altar, offerings are poured into or cast into the fire to be taken to the gods, and that procedure is described in the Brahmanas. So the prominent themes of the Brahmanas are Agni, the fire god, the god of that fire altar, and also instructions for the presiding priest, you could say, who's called the Brahman. This may be a bit confusing, but Brahman or Brahmana with a long A in the first syllable, Brahman, that is the name for the priest in Sanskrit. Brahman, which is a related word, obviously, just means supreme as an adjective. So the supreme priest or Brahman is going to be the one in charge of a ceremony that has multiple priests. The picture on the right is just of a page of a 13th century manuscript of one of the Brahmanas, the Shatapatha Brahmana. So the Samhita is the original text, you could say, of the Veda. The Brahmanas are the interpretations, explanations, commentaries for the Brahmins. What else could you need in terms of the Veda? Well, the Aranyakas, which started to be authored around 700 BC and continue up to the period of the early Upanishads, so roughly the 500s BC, these were books that were giving a deeper level of interpretation of the meaning of Vedic sacrifice. The name literally means a forest book or a forest treatise. So these would have been traditionally transmitted orally by Brahmins or priests who removed themselves from society and lived in the forest or lived in the wilderness, or at least on the outskirts of human villages. And they would teach the secret, the esoteric, the deeper meaning of the rituals to their students. So their analysis and interpretation of the fire ritual was often cosmological. So there's a correspondence between the ritual and the cosmos itself. So one way of interpreting this is instead of sacrificing just an animal to a god, when you do that ritual, you're symbolically sacrificing your attachments to all the parts of the cosmos or universe, and thus enabling you to transcend this limited material existence and attain union with Brahman or something higher. So there's also a belief in the Aranyakas that the Vedic rituals have a kind of intrinsic power, whereas the gods are almost just functionaries or labels or intermediaries for what is going on. This actually resembles the interpretation of the Devas in the later Darshana of Purva Mimamsa. So the Aranyakas represent a transition between the Brahmanas, which are still quite ritualistic, and the more purely philosophical, contemplative, and mystical Upanishads. There's a gradual tendency, which you do see starting in the later Veda itself. Like Book 10 of the Rig Veda has hymns that touch on Brahman, the mysteries of creation, and so on. But this tendency develops through the Aranyakas and is developed even more in the Upanishads. A tendency towards monotheism regarding only one supreme being, Brahman, as the main god. Monism, there are monistic tendencies of some of the Upanishads implying that not only is Brahman the only supreme god, supreme being, but everything in a sense is in Brahman. Or you could say pantheism, that all is in God. And there is no single theology, no single philosophy or metaphysics that can be taken from the Aranyakas or Upanishads, but all of these ideas are expressed in different ways in different texts. So the Upanishads, which date to around the 500s BC and after, for the few centuries after, the name is sometimes interpreted as sitting down at the foot of, but I've read several people say that's a mistaken interpretation of the Sanskrit, that the actual meaning is something like a secret or hidden connection between things. And that makes sense because a lot of the Upanishads touch on this theme of either a secret meaning of a Vedic ritual or just hidden connections between things in the reality that we experience, the material world or other aspects of reality. So it presents itself as commentaries on the Samhitas and Brahmanas, but it's really giving a new philosophy, a new ideology, which is only tangentially related to the ritualism of the Veda. In fact, there are often criticisms of Brahmins who are ritualists or who focus on the fire sacrifice in the Upanishads. Rather, the Upanishads emphasize this internal spiritual sacrifice of a person's attachments as being more important, as leading to the jnana or spiritual knowledge of the divine. So some of the doctrines introduced in the Upanishads are those of the Atman, the soul or the self. So the teaching is that neither the physical body nor the ordinary mind is the true self, but rather this pure consciousness that transcends ordinary experience. And many Upanishads also teach that the true self of an individual person is the same as Brahman, the supreme being. So there's a connection between the true self of a human and the supreme self of the entire universe. So this implies, on some interpretations, monism, that everything is the supreme being Brahman, including the Atman or self. So the way to unlock this spiritual knowledge and to attain the consciousness of the true self and of Brahman is through tapas, or renunciation. And another word for this is pranagnihotra, which can be translated as giving up one's own body in the fire or agni of one's breath, prana. So there's a sacrifice, hotra, of one's breath, prana, or life energy in the fire. And the fire is also associated with tapas itself, that there's a kind of spiritual heat that's generated through one's effort. So it's analogous to giving offerings into the Vedic fire altar, but it's believed to be more effective than just the external ritual. So the goal of all this is to attain moksha, which means freedom or liberation, but it's a state where one's true self or Atman is realized and it unites somehow, or the already existing union of one's true self with Brahman is realized fully. In the picture is just a photograph of a sannyasin, a renunciate. Sannyasins have different appearances. It can depend on their sect. Going back to antiquity, many of them would have dreadlocks, though, like this, matted hair. So they wouldn't cut their hair, they wouldn't clean it, and they would let their beard grow as well. So we have ancient Buddhist texts, for example, and others describing such ascetics going back to the period of the Upanishads. And the Upanishads also elaborate the doctrine of karma, or moral action leading to certain results. The Upanishads are the last level or part of the Veda, and thus the last part of Shruti, or revealed scripture. The remaining types of scripture are Smriti, or remembered, that is, they have human authors, although they're still believed to be divinely inspired and authoritative. The term sutra means literally a thread, So it means a thread of writing or thinking or speech. You could call it a treatise, an essay. It's related to the English word suture, which is a thread used to bind a wound. Uh, the Dharma Sutras could also be called Dharma Shastras, which means collection. There are basically different texts related to Dharma, or the moral law. The most famous of which is the Manavadharma Shastra, or the Manusmriti, which is translated often the laws of Manu. Manu, in Hindu belief, is an ancient human who survived the Great Flood and who transmitted his knowledge of the Dharma to later generations of people. So the laws of Manu describe the duties and laws that are binding on all Hindus, but the specific rules, including how to greet people, rules of etiquette, can be relative to a person's varna or caste, their ashrama or stage of life, and their gender, whether male or female. And the general view is that everyone must obey their dharma. It's a necessary condition for attaining moksha, but it's not a sufficient condition. Depending on the view, you may also have to practice austerities, as in the Upanishads, or devotion, bhakti, as in the Bhagavad Gita and the later Puranas. The Itihasa refers to the epics or history, and there are two main epic texts, Ramayana and Mahabharata. These have stories about gods, heroes, and avatars or incarnations of gods. The belief is that even though these tales feel like legends or histories, analogous perhaps to modern fantasy novels that describe characters on amazing adventures, they do still have a religious, a spiritual significance. Among other reasons, they have moral themes, and also some of the characters are incarnations of gods. According to Hindu tradition, Valmiki, a sage, is the author of the Ramayana, and Vyasa, another sage, is the author of the Mahabharata. Modern scholars tend to view these as not having single authors, but rather as being compilations of folktales, songs, and stories composed by many different poets and minstrels over a period of centuries, and later kind of edited together. There are common themes in Ramayana and Mahabharata, including the struggle between good and evil. And in both, good, the side of good and the gods, ultimately wins, but usually through difficulty. They may have to compromise or resort to devious stratagems. And at the end of these epics is the end of the heroic age, you might say. As we'll see later, Hindus have a cosmic theory of time, which goes in a cycle, but the fourth and last phase of the cycle happens after the end of Ramayana and Mahabharata. So they're kind of the end of the heroic age when people are still capable of greater levels of virtue and purity, and after them is the Kali Yuga, where moral decline sets in. The tales often feature princes or royal cousins, in the case of Mahabharata, who are excluded from kingship and forced into exile. There can be divine intervention, such as by Vishnu, to support the good people. And yes, the good ultimately triumph, but after many reversals of fortune. And these tend to be very, very long tales. So it's a very complex plot. And the heroes, such as Rama and Arjuna and the other Pandavas in Mahabharata, they are meant to be role models for Hindus today. So that's also part of their religious significance, is you can learn moral virtue by studying the examples of the heroes of Ramayana and Mahabharata. There's a theme, you see this, for example, in Mahabharata at the end, of the quest for moksha. So they're connected to this larger spiritual goal of later Vedic religion and also of the sectarian Hinduism of attaining moksha, especially under the guidance of a god like Vishnu or Krishna. So Vaishnavism is the main theme of both, because each one of these epics has an incarnation of the god Vishnu. Ramayana has Rama, who's an incarnation of Vishnu. Mahabharata has Krishna, who's an incarnation of Vishnu. So we'll talk briefly about Mahabharata. This is a very long text, so I'm not even going to try to summarize the plot. If you want to make a comparison to modern culture, it's like one of the franchises of films that have multiple films and multiple TV series all telling one larger story. Like I'm reminded of like the Marvel series of movies and TV series, or the DC, or something like the Star Wars films, including the expanded universe. So that's the kind of scale of storytelling that we're talked about. This is more than you can tell in a single recitation. So it's a very, very long work. One of the climactic scenes, though, is the Battle or War of Kurukshetra, which is the final showdown between the two main sides, the Pandavas, which are 5 good guys, human heroes, and the Kauravas, which are basically their evil cousins, who seized the throne of the kingdom of Bharat or Bharata from them. So after the end of Mahabharata, even though the Pandavas win, it marks the beginning of the Kali Yuga, the age of evil and moral corruption, after which there's a gradual decline of honor, compassion, and chivalry. In the picture is just before the Battle of Kurukshetra, where the Kauravas on the left are facing off against the Pandavas on the right. Ramayana is about the prince Rama, who's actually an incarnation of the god Vishnu. And his main antagonist is Ravana, an evil demon king who lives on the island of Lanka off the south coast of India, corresponding to the modern nation of Sri Lanka. Rama is the designated heir of his father's kingdom in Ayodhya, but through scheming of his mother and his stepbrother, he's basically deprived of the throne. So he has to go into exile. He's already married. His wife is Sita. She goes with him, as does another brother of his who's loyal to him named Lakshmana. They have a lot of adventures along the way. Eventually, Sita is kidnapped by the evil demon king Ravana and taken to his island of Lanka. But Rama is able to defeat Ravana in part with the help of Hanuman, a monkey god basically, who's a very loyal devotee of Rama and who's kind of like a type or symbol of the perfection of devotion to Vishnu, insofar as Rama is an avatar of Vishnu. And Hanuman is just one of the Varanas, which are forest-dwelling creatures often shown as monkeys, as in this image. They're monkeys, but they have human intelligence and speech, and their army is able to help Rama defeat Ravana. So just as Rama is regarded as an avatar of Vishnu, his wife Sita is regarded as an avatar or human incarnation of Vishnu's divine consort, the goddess Lakshmi or Sri. So the Bhagavad Gita is a part of Mahabharata, and we get this teaching in the form of a dialogue between Arjuna, one of the heroes or Pandavas, and the god or avatar Krishna, who's usually regarded as an avatar of Vishnu in Hinduism. So Bhagavad Gita means Song of the Lord, and it's a tiny part of Mahabharata, but it's probably the most religiously influential part. It is regarded as a revealed or Shruti scripture because much of it is in the form of words in the mouth of the character Krishna, who is meant to be an avatar of Vishnu, and thus this is words from God himself, you might say. So it's a very interesting dialogue. It occurs before the Battle of Kurukshetra, and it takes place when Arjuna is in his chariot. So chariots were used in ancient Indian warfare, in part for mobility in the battlefield. And there'd be 2 people in the chariot, the warrior, who is usually an archer who would shoot from the back of the chariot, and there'd be a driver who would help manage the team of horses and drive the chariot around the battlefield. And there's often a theme that a rider in a chariot might talk to their driver to get advice from them and to just strategize about the battle. But in this case, Arjuna is asking for advice from Krishna about religion, about morality, about salvation. So he sees all of his cousins, albeit evil cousins, the Kauravas, but he sees them across the field of battle, and he starts to have second thoughts about whether he should even fight, because he's heard that killing is wrong. And in fact, in the Upanishads, which were an earlier text in Hinduism, taking life, including even that of animals, was regarded as a terrible sin that would prevent you from attaining salvation or moksha. And moreover, he says not only is killing in general wrong, but especially killing his own blood relatives. But Krishna, perhaps surprisingly, tells him he should fight because he's a kshatriya, a noble warrior, and part of his dharma or duty is to fight in a just war to defend his kingdom and to fight against evil. So the Bhagavad Gita is a synthesis of many different strands or aspects of Hinduism. It combines the idea from the Upanishads of the Jnana Marga, or the path of knowledge. This means you need a certain secret spiritual knowledge in order to attain moksha or liberation. But also it combines yoga. So one of the many different types of yogas or margas that is discussed in the Bhagavad Gita is yoga in the sense of meditation. Now, yoga has different senses in Hinduism. It can mean meditation or it can mean any spiritual discipline. And you see both usages in the Bhagavad Gita. But the idea is that Krishna teaches to Arjuna is that, in fact, there are multiple paths to moksha. So this is adding to the Upanishads, which only talked about renunciation as being a path to moksha. You have to live as an ascetic, you have to be a shramana, you have to practice tapas, you have to be celibate, and so on. Arjuna is getting a different message from Krishna. So Krishna is saying, actually, there's multiple paths to moksha. Moksha is the goal. You do want to unite your soul with God, with Brahman, which Krishna ultimately identifies as himself, because he identifies as the supreme being in the Bhagavad Gita. But there are many paths, and the other path, the new one that's introduced, is Bhakti Marga, or the path of devotion. So just through love of Krishna, one can transcend the self that way, transcend the self in the sense of a negative self, an individual ego, rather than the true self that's divine. So you can transcend your ego or your small self, you might say, and through your love of Krishna attain that state of salvation or moksha. And another one of the margas is Nishkama Karma Marga, which basically means you have karma or action, but without attachment, nishkama. So without desire, without a longing for some result. And this is related to Krishna's advice to Arjuna to fight in this war, because he says you can do your duty, you can perform these actions, including the violent actions of warfare, but if you do it without selfish attachment to victory, to result, you could say just for the sake of the good itself, or just for the sake of justice itself, then this self-sacrificial action can be another pathway to moksha. So even though in the case of that particular battle, Krishna recommends action, or the Nishkama Karma Marga, to Arjuna, he says that the path of devotion or bhakti is actually the highest pathway to moksha, because it's available to everyone, even if you're young and not old, even if whether you're male or female, regardless of your varna, you can still have love of Krishna and thus attain moksha that way. So this text, although it's written around 200 BC, the idea of bhakti, the idea of devotion to a personal God like Krishna that has a human form and personality, and that you can have a personal relationship with, that has a huge influence on later sectarian Hinduism that develops in the first millennium AD. So we're moving on to another type of a smriti or remember text, the Puranas. And the Puranas are associated with the rise of sectarian and devotional Hinduism in the first millennium AD. They were composed over many centuries, over a period of 1,000 years, and there's many different Puranas. Traditionally, there's 18 major Puranas, where there are regarded as being 6 for each of the 3 main gods of the Trimurti or Hindu Trinity. 6 for Brahma, the creator god. 6 for Shiva, the god of yoga, meditation, and destruction of the cosmos. And 6 for Vishnu, the god of Dharma and the cosmic order. But there are many other Puranas associated with minor deities, some with particular sacred sites, and others for the gods of the Trimurti as well. So the contents are wide-ranging. They do include legends of the gods and their avatars, but also genealogies, law codes, descriptions of rituals, and of pilgrimages to holy places. They are the basis for much later Hindu theology, belief, and practice, including the temple-based puja or worship you see today. So they are structuring the new form of temple worship that is an alternative to the fire altar worship of the early Veda. Although, as I've mentioned before, most Hindus today, while they usually practice temple worship, they also participate in or sponsor fire altar rituals in other contexts as well. This is just a picture from a Purana showing the goddess Kali at the center bottom with the long tongue, leading the Matrikas or mother goddesses in a fight against some demons. Chapter 15, Hindu Beliefs. So I mentioned this a couple times, but there is a huge amount of diversity in Hinduism, even more so than other major religions because of its history. It didn't have a single organized church or clergy. There was always local variation, even going back to the very early period of the Aryan migration or in the centuries thereafter, where the only thing that the Hindus have in common is the Veda, but it's up to, in a sense, individual Brahmins or individual lineages of Brahmins to make their own judgments about how to interpret it in a given case. So the diversity, though, really increased later in Hindu history as well, when you get the Upanishads, new texts with a new focus on the religion, like the goal is moksha rather than worldly success through offerings to the gods in the fire altar, and later with devotional Hinduism and so on. So there are many different strands or types of Hinduism, and different gods and goddesses worshipped, including in different parts of India, different styles of art and architecture and so on, different systems of philosophy or darshans. Nevertheless, there is a core there that all Hindus share, and it's basically the Veda itself and the authority of the Brahmins to teach, interpret it, and perform Vedic rituals. So many Hindus do believe the essential teachings of their religion are eternal and unchanging. So the Sanatana Dharma idea. And if you had to give like a list of some of the basic Hindu beliefs, authority of the Veda and other Hindu scriptures, Satya or truth as a value. So this idea goes back to the early Vedic period. Like a king, for example, would have considered it a great dishonor to ever break their word. Ahimsa or nonviolence. This teaching appears to originate in the Upanishads. It's advocated there as a way of attaining moksha, that if you don't practice ahimsa, that's a very evil act, it's bad karma, and will keep you trapped in samsara. The idea of karma itself, coming from the Upanishads and later texts, that your actions will influence not only your current life, but your future lives as well. The notion of purity, spiritual purity, is being very important, and different rituals to attain that, such as bathing in the river Ganges. The value of hospitality to the guests, this also goes back to the ancient Vedic period, when based on the tribal social structure, it was often very important to show guests hospitality just in order to have a social order, a social framework that wouldn't be constant fighting between different tribes and clans. Value of respect for elders and parents. Practice of puja or worship every day to gods and goddesses. So for example, a lot of Hindus will say prayers in the morning, noon, and evening, 3 times a day. Pilgrimage to sacred sites, and the caste system, including the 4 varnas from the early Veda, and also the judis that I mentioned previously. Gotras are another concept related to this. That's your clan. And the rule is usually that you must marry someone in the same jati, but you must marry someone in a different gotra. So that's the custom, the way that plays out. And the picture is just some young Brahmins learning the Veda through memory and recitation from their teacher, shown in the back. So there are many different gods and goddesses worshipped in Hinduism, and also different theologies. If you look at the early Veda, it's pretty polytheistic. There's just many distinct gods and goddesses, including Indra, Agni, Soma, and Ushas, and so on. Although you do get the teaching, especially towards the end of the Rig Veda, that there's one Brahman, one supreme being, who's kind of above or prior to them. Now that teaching is developed more in the Upanishads and later texts, which really tends to emphasize the importance of Brahman in contrast or comparison to the Devas, the many gods of the Veda. So in the Upanishads, for example, it will say that the Devas only get their power from Brahman. Monotheism, so some Hindus are monotheistic and that they literally believe there's only one God. And in a way, they can still worship the other gods and goddesses, but they don't regard them as distinct beings, but rather just as manifestations of the one God Brahman. Whereas the polytheistic Hindus would acknowledge the separate existence of gods and goddesses, but just tend to regard them as creations of the supreme God Brahman. Some Hindus are monistic, so this is a philosophical theory, specifically a metaphysical theory, that says all reality is one being, one substance. This is only found, though, in the Advaita Vedanta darshana of Hinduism. Most Hindus are actually dualistic, and they believe in a plurality of substances, so there's one supreme being, Brahman, but a multitude of beings in the creation, both souls and material objects. And there's even some Hindus who could be classified as atheists, particularly of the Purva Mimamsa Darshana on some interpretations, because they seem to deny the independent existence of the Devas, and they put the fundamental power of the Vedic rituals in the ritual itself and as it's interacting with the structure of the cosmos, you might say, rather than the personality of a god or goddess named in the ritual. Brahman is the supreme being, worshipped and recognized by almost all Hindus. The usual belief is that Brahman can manifest in many different forms, and thus can appear as different gods or goddesses or avatars. There is a distinction made between Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman. Nirguna Brahman means God or Brahman without characteristics. Nir without, guna characteristics or properties. This is the purely transcendent God that does not have a material form. You could think of it as a pure spirit or pure consciousness. In Hinduism, it's described as Sat Chit Ananda, or being, consciousness, and bliss. So those are the three properties, but otherwise it doesn't have visible or tangible properties. Saguna Brahman is God or Brahman with a visible or otherwise perceptible form. This can include the avatars or incarnations of the Supreme Being, such as Krishna or Rama. And Brahman is also often believed to be able to manifest as human gurus or saints. So throughout the history of Hinduism, at least since the devotional period, some living humans have been recognized as incarnations of the Supreme Being, and that sometimes still happens to this day. So I mentioned the monism of Advaita Vedanta, just a brief recap of that. They regard everything as part of Brahman or God. So it follows that the universe, the physical universe, you could describe it as the body of God, or you could just say it is a creation, a manifestation of God's power. The universe is usually described as Maya or illusion by Advaita Vedantists, so it doesn't have real or independent existence. It's just a manifestation of God's creative power. So even though they believe in many gods and goddesses, most Hindus have one or a small number of Ishtadevas, a chosen deity that they're especially devoted to. And so even if they believe that Brahman can manifest in multiple forms, they will choose one, such as Krishna or such as Rama or the goddess Kali, to whom they are particularly devoted. The exact relation between Brahman and the gods and goddesses, that can vary from Hindu to Hindu or sect to sect, and that's why there are these different theologies. So when you look at Brahman and the Devas or gods and the Devis or goddesses, some Hindus would worship the gods and goddesses as distinct beings with their own independent existence, as well as their own stories and icons, and others would just worship them as manifestations of Brahman. The idea of all of these gods, or a large number of beings, as manifestations of one being is shown in the Vishvarupa image, which you can see on the slide. This is Vishnu manifesting in the form of thousands and thousands of different individual human-shaped beings all at once. So it's taken as symbolic, at least, of God's power of manifesting in many ways in samsara. Now, there are often groupings of gods in Hinduism that could be worshipped together. The two main ones are the Trimurti and the Panchayatana Puja gods. So the Trimurti means three images, three Murti, image or icon, sometimes called the Hindu Trinity. So traditionally, these are the three main ways that Brahman manifests as Saguna Brahman. The first one is Brahma, and this could be confusing because his name is very close to Brahman, the supreme being. Brahma has a masculine ending, whereas Brahman has a neuter ending. So Brahma is suggesting a male god who has a particular physical form or visible appearance. And you can see him on the far right of this image. He's usually shown as a man with four heads, all of which are bearded. He's seldom worshipped now, though, on his own. He's usually worshipped by Vaishnavas as a creative aspect of Vishnu. So Vishnu, whom you can see in the center here, is regarded as the preserver of Dharma or the cosmic order. And Shiva is regarded in different ways. He's a patron of yogis, meditation, renunciation, but also of the destruction of evil, illusion, and ignorance. And you can see him on the left here. He has his trident, which is used as a symbol of the god. He has a leopard skin, so often Shiva will be depicted as a meditating yogi seated on a leopard or tiger skin, and some Hindu human yogis do that as well. He also has a garland or necklace of skulls. This is often a type of iconography used for destructive or fearsome deities in Hinduism, often associated with tantric Hinduism. So the idea of the destructive or fearsome side is not that this is an evil god or one that you should be afraid of, but rather it's the wrathful appearance of divine justice when it's slaying or destroying evil or ignorance. And it may appear threatening to an individual worshiper, but that will only be the case if they have attachments to material things still. Otherwise, the destructive aspects of Shiva are part of the pathway to liberation. Once you let go of your attachments to worldly things, it's like you're destroying the world spiritually. You're offering the world as a sacrifice, and that's how you can actually attain union with Shiva or Brahman. There's another group of 5 gods, and worshiping them is called Panchayatana Puja. So these 5 gods are Vishnu, Shiva, Devi, the goddess, Surya, the sun god, and Ganesha, the elephant-headed god. He's the god of overcoming obstacles, and he's the son of Shiva. So Shiva and Vishnu are by far the most widely worshipped as supreme or Brahman. And among Vaishnavas, it's also very common to worship Krishna or Rama, his chief avatars. So a bit more about Vishnu and Vaishnavism. Vishnu is a god of Dharma, of cosmic order. It's believed that he incarnates to restore the Dharma in the universe. And he's also associated with divine kingship, in particular in his incarnation as Rama. Rama and Krishna are the 2 most popular incarnations, but there's 10 main avatars of Vishnu, collectively known as the Dash Avataras, and various of those are popular throughout India as well. Some of those stories go back to the early Veda, like the 3 steps of Vishnu, where he incarnates as a Brahmin priest who's a dwarf, very short, in order to trick an evil demon king who was then able to rule the world and get the world back for the gods. Essentially, he appears in the king's court as this short priest or Brahmin and asks the king for a favor. This was a common custom in ancient India. Kings would give favors to priests in exchange for blessings. So the demon king says yes, but the favor asked of Vishnu in the form of this dwarf priest is he wants to rule as much land as he can cover in 3 steps. When the king grants the request, he's kind of chuckling because he thinks this person is very short, has a short stride, so he won't be able to walk very far in 3 steps. But as soon as that happens, Vishnu expands to his true cosmic size and steps down from heaven to earth, then from earth to the underworld, and the 3rd step is on the forehead of the demon king itself, which you can see illustrated in the lower right corner of this image. So all of the avatars of Vishnu have similar interesting stories. You'll notice as well in the middle of the right side, the Buddha. So some Hindus regard the Buddha, the founder of Buddhism, as an avatar of Vishnu, although Buddhists do not agree with that interpretation. But on this Hindu telling, they regard the Buddha as having preached against animal sacrifice, and that Vishnu is having incarnated as the Buddha in order to try to stop the practice of animal sacrifice among Hindus and institute vegetarianism instead of eating meat. So by the way, not all Hindus are vegetarian, but that practice is common among some Vaishnavas, especially among Brahmins. A bit more about Shiva and Shaivism. So Shiva's name means the auspicious. He's the lord of yogis, practitioners of meditation and renunciation or asceticism. In this form, he's often depicted with matted hair, like an ascetic, and his body may be smeared with holy ash. So holy ash is a particular type of ash that can be smeared by ascetics on their body. Holy ash is specifically the ashes from the cremated remains of humans. So this would be in particular a left-hand tantric practice that would be regarded as controversial among some Hindus, but some yogis do practice these things where they may try to force a confrontation with death or other horrifying things just as part of their quest for salvation. The basic reason why you would do things like hold a skull, drink from a skull, or smear human remains in ash form on your body is just to overcome the fear of death and attachment to your mortal life. But that's not a very common it's not a thing that most Hindu renunciates do, but some do that. And likewise, meditating in a charnel ground. This is in an area where bodies have been cremated in accordance with Vedic ritual. And again, the point of that would be to kind of come face to face with the reality of death, mortality, and to try to attain a vision or realization of union with the divine. But Shiva can also appear as a divine lover, so he's the male counterpart to the goddess. They show the two different sides of divinity. And in Hindu thought and theology, the male is often associated with the remote or transcendent aspect of divinity, the female with the earthly active aspect of divinity, including violent manifestations that would fight demons and evil and stuff. That's often in female form, such as with the goddess Kali. So Shiva is sometimes symbolized by a seated cross-legged meditator, but also by a abstract cylinder called a linga, which represents a phallus, but it also represents just the vertical transcendent dimension of male divinity. And it's typically put on a yoni or horizontal slab, which represents the feminine, horizontal, manifested in the world female aspect of divinity. So Shiva's wife is Parvati, and he has two sons, Ganesha and Skanda, or Murugan. Ganesha is the elephant-headed god, who's also very popular. He's the god of overcoming obstacles. And according to Shaivas, all of this, what you might think of as frightening imagery with Shiva, like the fact that he may have holy ash smeared on him, or he might be holding a skull, or he might have a garland of skulls and such like, or he might be doing the dance, a Lord of the Dance, where he's surrounded by a circle of fire, symbolizing destruction of the cosmos. So this destructive aspect of Shiva is not regarded just as purely negative, purely frightening, or violent in the negative sense, threatening, but rather as just the dark side of, you might say, of liberation, of enlightenment, because it's through the destruction of mortal things and the letting go of attachments to mortal things that the immortal, the eternal, the true, the divine can be realized. And it's interesting too that he himself has these two sides. On the one hand, he's the patron of yogis or renunciates who give up sex. Brahmacharya is one of the main renunciations practiced by Hindu ascetics. But also he is the male counterpart to the female goddess Devi, or when it's named particularly as his consort Parvati, or also called Shakta, which means female divine energy. So he has this erotic side as well, where he's participating in the cycle of life. And I think the idea that most Hindus would have is that, he's kind of transcending both sides of this dichotomy. He's both manifest in the world, part of the cycle of life, creation, destruction, but simultaneously transcendent, and he's already gone beyond that and experienced unity with the divine, with the eternal. So speaking of Devi, or the goddess, this is the third main type of Hindu devotional or sectarian worship, Shaktism. So the word Devi just means goddess. Shakti means power, strength, or force, and it can refer to divine energy in general, but such power is often associated with goddesses in particular. In Hindu theology, they're more connected with worldly, physical manifestations. Mahadevi is also kind of a generic name. It means the great goddess, so it can be associated with other particular goddesses like Durga or Kali, but this will vary. Some Hindus see goddesses as distinct beings, others just as diverse manifestations or forms of the one great goddess Mahadevi. So the goddess is kind of like the two sides of Shiva, or contrasting the destructive, ferocious side of Shiva with the more calm, orderly Vishnu. Goddesses too can be either restrained or dangerous. The restrained or cool goddesses demonstrate the traditional womanly virtues in Hindu Dharma. So being faithful to their husband, sacrificing themselves for the sake of their husband or for their own honor, having integrity and courage. For example, Sita, Rama's wife in Ramayana. The more dangerous or violent or hot goddesses embody the destructive side of Shakti, such as Durga and Kali. And again, this destructive side is not viewed as just negative or evil. Rather, it's a manifestation of divine anger. And these goddesses, they're often depicted as bloodthirsty, and they have weapons, and they're covered in the body parts of their enemies. But who are their enemies? What are they slaying? They're slaying demons, i.e. they're slaying ignorance and sin. Bharat Mata is Mother India. Bharat is India, Mata is mother. So sometimes India itself is worshipped as a mother goddess. And there are these Shakti Pittas, or centers of goddess worship throughout India. So if you look at Ganges and the other rivers, these are often associated with goddesses. Another example is Saraswati, which is a mythical river, but it's associated with the goddess of music and art and literature. So goddess worship is very popular. It's right up there with Vaishnavism and Shaivism. There are a lot of Shaktas. In this particular image, we see Lalita, also known as Tripura Sundari, who's another popular goddess in Hinduism. So we talked about the Trimurti, the three main manifestations of Brahman, namely Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Well, each of these particular gods also has their own wife or consort who's a goddess. So the consort term is meant to suggest either a wife or a sexual partner or just a female counterpart. So this can also be called Adya Shakti. So they can be worshipped either as the supreme being in their own right. So there are Shaktas, and Shaktas regard one of the goddesses as Brahman, or as just the consort of a male god. So a Vaishnava, for example, might also worship Lakshmi, who's the consort of Vishnu. Saraswati, as mentioned, is the goddess of music and learning and literature, and she's the consort of Brahma. Lakshmi is the goddess of good luck, fortune, and she's the consort of Vishnu. And Parvati is the goddess of love and fertility, and she's the consort of Shiva. So you also hear Tridevi, or three goddesses, as a kind of female counterpart to the Trimurti, or three gods. I've been mentioning this term avatar. The term is familiar to us nowadays because of its internet usage for like an online persona, but it comes from Sanskrit and it can be translated as descent. It's a manifestation of a god in the form of a particular human, or at least a particular physical creature. And the avatars generally intervene to fight evil and uphold the cosmic dharma. By far, the most widely worshipped avatars are those of Vishnu, specifically Krishna and Rama. So Krishna tends to be worshipped in one of three forms: as a small child who's kind of mischievous but very adorable and whose mother dotes on him; as a young man who is the object of the love and lust of the gopis, or herding girls, as you can see in this image on the right. So he's the god of a kind of erotic but mystical love. So the idea is the gopis are in love with him, they're attracted to his physical body, but this is just a kind of stepping stone to the truer divine love that the soul has for God. So that's often seen as a type for the soul's love of God in Hinduism. And finally, as an older adult male, he's a hero of the Mahabharata. He gives his divine wisdom and counsel to Arjuna in Bhagavad Gita, for example. There's also the concept of Krishna Lila, or the play or sport of Krishna. So as a youth, he's very mischievous, but he also will be playful with the gopis. So it emphasizes this playful aspect of Brahman. That part of the purpose of the creation from the Hindu perspective is just sheer delight in beauty, delight in form, and that's why Brahman creates the cosmos, even though it's just limited, material, and fleeting. It's a type of play of Brahman. So this is also connected to Hindu views of how to attain moksha. If you embrace the cosmos in the spirit of play, you won't be attached to particular manifestations, and so that will help you transcend your attachments, transcend your karma, and attain union with Brahman. And you can see in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna really kind of revealing himself as Brahman, as supreme. He teaches Arjuna and anyone else who's reading it the path to moksha, reveals himself at one point in the dialogue in his true transcendent form as the supreme God. So Rama is the other famous avatar of Vishnu. So in Ramayana, he's depicted as an ideal, very wise and virtuous king and ruler who restores the dharma of his kingdom in Ayodhya. So he's often been popular in northern India. He's worshipped in other parts as well, but he's especially prominent in the north. And he's now associated with Hindu nationalism, in part because he's the ideal ruler, the ideal king, and his period of rule, which is called Ram Rajya, is regarded as an age of social justice, harmony, and prosperity. So it's kind of what a modern Hindu political order would aspire to. Murtis, or images or icons, are used by the vast majority of Hindus. So although Hindus usually believe in Brahman as a supreme transcendent God that cannot be literally depicted in human or other form, they also worship that Saguna Brahman, Brahman as manifest in a particular form or image. Most Hindus believe that the power or Shakti of a god is present in their image. So there's actually a consecration ceremony performed by Brahmins as a part of sectarian or devotional Hinduism. And after the ceremony is performed, the physical image or icon becomes embodied with the presence, the spirit of the divine. And so it becomes sacred. When you look at the image, when you get darshana or vision, sight of that icon, it's like looking at the god himself or herself. That's the belief. And during puja or ritual worship, both at home and in temple, offerings are given or presented before these images of the gods. And the images themselves are often served and cared for as if they were honored guests, as if they were human. So darshana is an important concept in Hinduism. The basic belief is that you can get blessings, good luck, or fortune, or grace, or merit just by being in visual contact with the divine. That could be an icon in a temple. It could also be looking at a guru or saint who's regarded as a living manifestation or reflection of the divine. This image in the picture on the right is of Durga Puja. So this would be a temporary image created during the Durga Puja festival in order to worship the goddess Durga. She is a goddess who's famous for slaying evil demons, and so that's why she's holding so many weapons in her arms. So a brief return to the concept of dharma. So it can be translated as duty and law, but also as social order, cosmic order. So it's actually connected to the earlier Vedic interpretation of Varuna, who is a god of covenants, of contracts, of keeping the cosmic order. But later on, it becomes more transcendent, not associated just with the god Varuna per se. If anything, Dharma nowadays is more associated with Vishnu, who incarnates to help preserve the Dharma. But it's sometimes used as a name for Hinduism itself. So Hinduism could be called the Santana or Sanatana Dharma, the eternal law, as well as the Vedic Dharma or law of the Veda, the key scripture of Hinduism. And the Bhagavad Gita basically says that there's different dharmas for different people based on their caste, their sex or gender, and their stage of life. And it says it's better to do your own duty imperfectly than another person's duty well. So this is a very Hindu view, that it's not that there's the same standards for everyone. In that sense, you could say humans are not equal, although that's a bit misleading use of equality. It's really just saying humans are not the same. So humans might be equally valuable insofar as we all have souls, or we are souls, or Atman, but the duty of a person is not the same as another. There's going to be some things that all humans have a duty to, like satya or truth, ahimsa or nonviolence, but otherwise it really is dependent on your particular role. And it's not just relative. It's not like the individual can decide what their duty is based on their own desire or belief or preference. No, there's an objective fact that underlies your duty, but it's based on these properties of you. Again, your sex, your age or stage of life, and the varna that you're born into based on your family. Samsara, or the endless cycle of rebirth. So the soul or Atman is perpetually reincarnated in many bodies. This doctrine is described briefly in the Veda, or the Samhita part of the Veda, but it's elaborated a lot more in the Upanishads and later texts. And so a lot of Hindu practices are connected to ending samsara. At least that's the ultimate goal. Now, most Hindus think that this is not an easy task. It may not be capable of being accomplished in one lifetime. So you may actually need to spend multiple lifetimes, multiple incarnations to make steady progress towards moksha, because of how hard it is to uproot the bad karma. The view is that karma is something in your soul, if you will, in your Atman. The Jains depicted it as a type of dirt or grit that would stick to your soul. That's not an image that all Hindus would accept, but it's definitely interpreted as a type of impurity. And the only way to get rid of the impurity of karma is through self-knowledge. So either through bhakti, devotion, or jnana, having the spiritual knowledge through meditation or renunciation. Tapas or austerities are also regarded as having burning off karma. And you might wonder, well, there's good karma and bad karma, is there not? So why would you want to get rid of all karma? Well, basically the Hindu view is that good karma is better than bad karma for sure. It will give you a better life and a better afterlife, but you're still getting good results in samsara. So the ultimate way of transcending samsara is by transcending karma altogether, having true self-knowledge, and having knowledge and union with the divine, with Brahman. Now, the view of samsara we see in the Upanishads and in later texts such as the Puranas is different from the view of the afterlife in the early Veda, so the early parts of the Samhita, like most of the Rig Veda, for example. The nature of the afterlife in the early Veda is a little sketchy, but the basic picture does not seem to include reincarnation. It talks about the land of the dead, or Yamaloka. Yama is the king of the dead, lord and judge of the dead. So he's one of the devas who rules in the underworld, or land of the dead. And so that's where the shades, or the spirits of the dead, go to. And there is another destination mentioned in the early Veda for the virtuous people. They can go to live with the ancestors, or Peter, with the gods, the devas, in a heavenly realm. So those are two possibilities. And the land of the dead is not depicted as a hell or a place of torment in the early Veda. It's more similar to the ancient Greek view of Hades, where there's a kind of shadowy post-mortem existence there. It's not a place of torment or suffering or punishment necessarily, but it's also kind of gloomy and not as nice as the land of the living or the land of the gods. But later on, this view of the afterlife is just a one and done thing where you're not continuously reincarnated. That gets reinterpreted as samsara. And so modern Hindus still believe in Yamaloka, the land of the dead, but it's just one of the possible places you could be reincarnated in. You could also be reincarnated as another person, perhaps a different gender, perhaps a different varna, or another world altogether, another level of existence, such as a hell realm, a heavenly realm, an animal existence, or even as a ghost, a pret. So let's talk a bit more about karma. It's from a word kur, kr, that means action. And although it literally refers to action, it's going beyond that. It's talking about the connection, the kind of necessary connection between action and fruit or result of action. This is sometimes depicted by the endless knot symbol you can see in the slide on the right. So karma is what keeps beings in samsara. Good karma will lead to good fortune in this life or to a good rebirth, reincarnation. Bad karma will lead to bad fortune in this life or a bad rebirth, such as a lower caste, an animal, or even rebirth in the hell realm. The hells in Hinduism are thought of as places of punishment, where you are being tormented for particular sins you indulged in during your previous or a previous life. And the details of all the hell realms and conceiving of them as places of torment, yes, that was a later development. It's not there in the early Veda, but you see it starting around the period of the Upanishads and after, especially in the Puranas. So the idea is you have to kind of burn off or work off your bad karma, especially that can be done through good karma, meritorious action, through religious ceremonies, or through bhakti, devotion to a god. And there's kind of like a progression, even though the goal is to transcend all karma by transcending all desire or attachment. Good karma is much better than bad karma, and it's kind of setting you on the path towards the higher or deeper renunciation that leads to moksha. So some look at this whole ideology and say, well, this is just a justification for people to accept their bad material circumstances, like if you're born into a low caste where you're discriminated against or something. But a lot of Hindus don't really look at it just in a negative sense, as though you're stuck in this position because of your bad karma from a past life. Karma is a kind of power as well that an individual has to shape their own destiny. Because they have the power to choose whether they will have good karma or bad karma, that can affect their future in this life and in the afterlife. So it's like through the choices you make right now, you can create a whole new reality, a whole new life for yourself, and eventually attain the supreme goal of union with the divine. So karma and moksha are linked in that the Bhagavad Gita teaches moksha can be attained through adherence to duty without attachment to result. So this is kind of like a new wrinkle on the idea that you have to transcend karma in order to attain moksha. Bhagavad Gita says you actually can continue your karma, but as long as you're doing good actions without inner attachment. So it's a kind of internal spiritual renunciation or sacrifice. That too is a path to moksha. And this idea of the Bhagavad Gita influenced the philosopher and political activist Mahatma or Mohandas K. Gandhi many centuries later, who he was alive in the 1900s. So this particular idea is taken from a 1982 edition of his autobiography that was published before. To see the universal and all-perceiving spirit of truth face to face, one must be able to love the meanest of creation as oneself. So that's one of the ideas about karma, that Gandhi was inspired by the Bhagavad Gita, that there's a kind of eternal one spirit of truth or consciousness in the world. You could call it Brahman from the usual Hindu perspective. But in order to see that, you have to not be discriminating against people of lower caste or lower orders of creation. So the idea is it's one self, one divine being manifesting on many different levels. And so there's still this kind of vision of like a universal love, a universal charity, a universal respect for beings, regardless of what their particular incarnation is. Many Hindus believe that there are multiple margas or paths to moksha. In the Bhagavad Gita, which appears to be the origin of this view, Krishna teaches Arjuna that there are many different yogas or spiritual disciplines that can all lead to moksha. Now, there are different views about the relationship between these margas. Some Hindus say that each path is sufficient for moksha, that is, you can just focus on one of the margas and attain moksha. And they may even say that a person must focus on one, so pursue that path deeply and fully in order to attain moksha. Others say that the three paths can be combined. So this is a sort of systematized view of three margas in particular, whereas in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna taught a larger and kind of indefinite number of yogas that could lead to moksha, but this is kind of a later standardized list of three margas, and sometimes it's actually used as a filter with which to interpret the original teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. But be that as it may, the three main paths are jnana, or spiritual knowledge, karma, or action, and bhakti, or devotion. So the path of knowledge, or jnana, means basically knowing the nature of reality, knowing your true self, which is pure consciousness, and realizing its deep state of union with Brahman, the Supreme Being. So this can be attained through studying the Veda or other scriptures, through meditation, and through self-purification. Traditionally, Jnana Marga is associated with the schools of darshan, or philosophy, such as Sankhya, or Sankhya Yoga, or Vedanta. So this in particular is often associated with people who attain moksha while they're still alive. This is called Jivan Mukta, or liberated in life. There's a belief in not only Hinduism, but also other South Asian religions like Buddhism and Jainism, that the state of spiritual liberation can actually be attained before death while you're still alive. This is different from Abrahamic religions like Christianity and Islam, that when they teach a heavenly or celestial paradise, it's usually thought of that the full state of salvation is only attained after death. But not so with Hinduism. And it's not always thought that only Jnana Marga leads to Jivan Mukta as a possibility. Any of the Margas can, as long as you attain moksha. You can do it while you're still alive. But the most common examples of it seem to be associated with Jnana Marga often, like very intelligent philosophers or saints or sages who are teachers, and they're the ones who are regarded as having attained moksha, and they also have that spiritual self-knowledge. The second marga is karma marga, which means the path of action or work. And this is based mainly on the teachings of Krishna and the Bhagavad Gita, that you can have this action doing your dharma or duty without selfish attachment to result. And this can be a path to liberation because you're transcending your small self or ego, attaining union with the true self, the big self, Atman. And this particular idea also inspired the political activist Gandhi, where he regarded his fight for social justice. It's a worldly goal, it's a political goal, but this could fit within the rubric of karma yoga as described in the Bhagavad Gita, because it is doing his duty based on his varna and based on his profession as a lawyer, and it was without selfishness, it's without attachment to result. So he was kind of giving up his life, he was willing to give up his life for this political goal, which is for the sake of his fellow countrymen, independence from Great Britain, essentially. There was another element, though, that Gandhi added. So unlike Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, who's encouraging Arjuna to fight in the war against his evil cousins, the Kauravas, Gandhi insisted on the ahimsa, or nonviolence, of the Upanishads and other Hindu texts. So for his point of view, in order for it to be selfless and just, the political activism must be nonviolent. And then it becomes part of this work, the spiritual work towards liberation as well. And then the third marga is that of bhakti, or devotion. So this is when you have intense love, devotion, a personal relationship to a god or goddess, and that selfless love allows you to transcend your ego, your past karma, and so on. So the prapatti is the state of complete self-surrender and love to the god Vishnu, and that's one illustration of what this looks like. Bhakti is actually the most common path because it's the easiest one in a sense to pursue. For example, you don't have to be a knowledgeable scholar, as with Jnana Marga, or have a lot of power, influence, as is sometimes necessary for Karma Marga. Anyone, even if they're little knowledge, not educated, or low status, low power, anyone can do bhakti, anyone can do devotion to God. So there's also this term sadhana, which means spiritual discipline, and it's similar to some uses of the word yoga. And there are many different spiritual disciplines associated with Hinduism, and each of these paths can be associated with multiple sadhanas. So for example, Jnana Marga can be associated with meditation, or yoga in the narrow sense. It can also be associated with study of the Veda and other things as well. In addition to the Trimarga, or three paths to moksha, Hindus have a larger notion of four purusharthas, or personal goals. Moksha is only one of the goals that people pursue. The others are kama, or pleasure, artha, or success, and dharma, or duty. So we'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail. So kama means pleasure or desire. And the Hindu view is that it can be permissible to pursue kama, but only if you don't violate dharma or the moral law in so doing. So the most intense type of pleasure and desire traditionally is that associated with sex, but there's also other types of pleasure, such as from playing, from the arts, literature, recreation, music, dance, etc. Note that the Kama Sutra, which is a very famous and well-known text outside of India, this is the sutra or discourse on pleasure, and it's connected to various stratagems or techniques for attaining sexual pleasure. This is not actually a religious text. And to put the goal of kama in context, as well as the whole system of the four purusharthas, most Hindus have the understanding that there's a hierarchy here. So kama is actually the lowest of the goals in significance. It's the one that's on the lowest level of being or consciousness. And if you pursue kama, it's actually a good way to keep yourself stuck in samsara, or maybe even be reincarnated in hell and being punished for your sins. Artha is success or wealth or power. And again, this one is only permissible if pursued within the rules of Dharma. And ideally, it should be pursued without desire, anger, greed, or other destructive emotions. So another example of a text that is not really a religious scripture, but that is related to one of these goals, is Kautilya's Artha Shastra, which was composed somewhere in the 3rd to 4th centuries BC. This is basically advice for kings and other powerful people on how to rule. And it argues that prosperity is the basis for a well-ordered state, and people need success to practice their religion. But this is mostly regarded as a secular text within Hinduism. It's not a sacred scripture like a Veda or a Purana, for example. With Dharma and Moksha, then we get to the more properly religious and spiritual side of the Purusharthas. So Dharma means law, duty, or cosmic order, which we talked about before. And the idea is this is a higher goal than either pleasure or success. So it's one that's more worthy of following. Dharma exists on the individual level based on the individual's caste, stage of life, and sex. That's the Svadharma. Also, it exists on an absolute or cosmic level. So this is indexed by the cosmic cycle, where Dharma can decline over time, like it reaches its lowest point in the Kali Yuga, which we're currently living through. And the idea is that if people pursue profit and pleasure outside of Dharma, this will lead to bad consequences for themselves and society as well. So even though pleasure and artha are listed as goals that can be pursued, it must be within the confines of Dharma. And finally, there's the highest, the transcendent goal, moksha, or spiritual freedom. So this is when you go even beyond your Dharma to not just have good karma or a good reincarnation, but rather union with the divine. Your soul unites with Brahman. You see your true self as pure consciousness and as one in some sense with Brahman. There's different interpretations of the nature of the union or communion depending on the theology of Hindus. But yeah, most Hindus would regard this as a hierarchy. This is kind of contrary to the way the textbook presents it, which kind of presents as, oh, they're all equally good. There might be some Hindus who believe that. That strikes me as more of like a modern Western interpretation, which likes to, in a sense, like degrade hierarchies or say that there's no highest value. But the usual sense you get from Hinduism itself is it's very hierarchical. It's very ordered. Kama is on the bottom. It's the lowest. It's the most dangerous of the goals in that sense spiritually. Moksha is the highest goal. It's the one that we should all ultimately strive for. So we mentioned already some of the Hindu views of death, the afterlife, reincarnation. So let's talk a bit more about that. In the early Veda, you get these funeral rituals for how to allow the dead to move on to the afterlife, the next life. And these are still performed today. So when a Hindu person dies, there's a cremation ceremony presided over by a Brahmin in accordance with the Veda. And the belief is that the ancestors or the Pitar will continue to exist in some form, including with the other shades in the land of the dead. And so they can still have a relationship, though, with their descendants. The Bhagavad Gita, though, has this to say about the afterlife, and this reflects a later view of the eternal self that gets reborn in new forms. Quote, just as a person casts off worn out garments and puts on others that are new, even so the embodied soul casts off worn out bodies and takes on others that are new. Weapons do not cleave the self. Fire does not burn the self. Waters do not drench the self. Winds do not parch the self. The self is the same forever, unmanifest, unthinkable, still, unquote. And so the idea is that the true self, or Atman, is this eternal, immaterial, non-manifest being, and it takes on many forms or incarnations based on its karma. So there's many different worlds in Hindu cosmology, and each world is a state of being, a state of consciousness, and a type of being who tends to live there. So there's heavenly realms where there's gods and angelic-like beings called Gandharvas and others. There are the human realm with the various castes and sexes. There's the animal realm. There are hells. This picture on the right is actually a depiction of different hells where people are being tormented for the sake of divine justice based on the sins they committed while they were alive. And it's also possible to be reborn as a ghost. So moksha, or liberation, is the complete goal, or the highest goal that's sought after by Hindus, and it represents a state of complete union with Brahman, with the divine, and that ends the cycle of reincarnation. But many Hindus regard it as a somewhat remote ideal, because you basically have to be a perfectly liberated, perfectly enlightened, if you will, saint in order to attain it. You have to erase all trace of bad karma or sin from your action and from your consciousness and self. And some Hindus believe this can be attained more easily with divine grace through bhakti or devotion. But others believe it must be pursued by a yogi or some other ascetic by very difficult means, like exposing the body to elements, meditation for long periods, or even practicing asceticism for multiple lifetimes. So Yama, or Yamraj, or Dharmaraj, is the god of the dead. He's often regarded as judging the dead, although he's especially associated with the hell realms. So this represents a kind of combination of these different layers or stages of Hindu belief. The earlier version, where it's just a single land of the dead for the most part, ruled over by Yama, is still there, but Yama becomes a ruler of the hell realm specifically. And then it's also possible to be reborn in another realm, like as an animal or a human, or even as a god if you have really good karma, for example. The ghosts are called Pret or Bhuta, and they may reappear to haunt the living or even possess them, similar to belief in ghosts in other societies. But a ghostly reincarnation would not generally be regarded as a good thing. Usually a ghost will reappear if they have some kind of obsession with something connected to their past life, and so that's why they're not moving on to a more different incarnation or different state. So I mentioned previously that Hindus have a cyclical view of the cosmos. This is called a cosmic cycle. There's periodic creation, preservation, destruction, and recreation of the entire cosmos or universe. And this is actually analogous to, it's a parallel on the macro level, on the large level, of the cycle of samsara, or birth, life, death, and rebirth of an individual soul, but the entire universe goes through that cycle. Hindus also have a very expansive view of existence. They conceive of it as not just one universe or world system, but as a multiverse of an unlimited number of world systems, each of which is on its own pattern of cycles, and each of which can have its own Brahma or creator god, its own Yama or god of the dead realms, etc., etc. So they have a very large, expansive view of creation, essentially their view is the creator Brahman is infinite, and so too is the creation. So there are cycles within cycles as well, wheels within wheels. The largest unit is essentially a kalpa, or a day of Brahma, which is 4.32 billion years long. And each day of Brahma has 14 periods of Manu, or Manvantaras. Each period of Manu has 4 great ages, or Maha Yuga, Maha Great Yuga age. And each of these great yugas has 4 non-great yugas, you could say, or just yugas, ages, which are of increasingly short duration. The first one is called the Krita, or Satya Yuga. The second one is called the Treta Yuga. The third one is called the Dvapara Yuga. And the fourth one is called the Kali Yuga, which is the one we're now living in our stage in the cosmic cycle. So as each of these ages progresses, people essentially get less virtuous, less wise, more violent, more sinful, and it comes to a height in the Kali Yuga. And so at the end of the Kali Yuga, Vishnu will incarnate with another avatar to help restore the Dharma and reset the cosmic cycle. But it goes on forever and will go on forever as long as there are souls being reborn in our universe because of their karma. Hypothetically, if there were ever a day when all the souls attain moksha, then potentially that cycle could come to an end. And yeah, the belief is that things are bad now, but they will get even worse. Instead of having virtue promoted by the government or by society or the culture, it's vice, this sort of thing. And a lot of Hindus will point to things of like our current society, our current culture, or even like global political issues and say, this is evidence that we're living in the Kali Yuga. So after the destruction of the universe as a whole, there's a state of dissolution called pralaya. And then it kind of dissolves into a kind of emptiness and nothingness, an unevolved state. But Vishnu, or Brahman, is still there the whole time. And so from that, a new whole universe is going to be created through a new Brahma, a new creator being. Hindus still believe in the power and wisdom of gurus, or spiritual teachers. Often the view is that unless you're already enlightened or very wise yourself, which most people aren't, you need to learn at the feet of a guru in order to get a living example of what it means to be wise, to be pure, to be on the path, or to have achieved moksha, or God consciousness. So gurus themselves can be treated as holy beings. They can be objects of darshana or worship, puja. Some gurus are initiated into lineages or sampradayas of teachers, going back centuries oftentimes. Others might gain their status by virtue of just their charisma, their ability to relate to others, to inspire others, their gifts as teachers, or spiritual gifts. So some gurus have a reputation for performing miracles, for example. So most Hindu gurus are going to just be teaching people born into the religion, but especially in the last century or so, there have been gurus who deliberately reach out to non-Hindus, including Westerners or just other foreigners, and some of those people end up converting to Hinduism. So a couple of examples of more recent or modern gurus, Shirdi Sai Baba, who's shown in the picture, taught self-realization as the goal and criticized love for material things. So this is a very familiar Hindu teaching associated with the path to moksha. But he also went against traditional Hindu teaching on caste and thought that Hindus should not discriminate against other Hindus based on their varna, on their jati, or even on the religion of a person, such as if they're Muslim or not Hindu, they shouldn't be treated differently. So he had both Hindu and Muslim followers, and he did not identify as a member of either religion. He regarded all religions as paths to the same goal. Now, not all Hindus believe that, but that is a belief that some Hindus have. And this is kind of the pluralistic and open aspect of Hinduism, even though they do have a Veda, they do have authority from the Veda and from the Brahmins, they do have set theologies, they do sometimes come into conflict with other religions like Islam or Christianity, but there is a view that some Hindus have that there are many different paths to the same goal, which is basically union with God. And some Hindus will even worship Muslim saints or have like Christian icons, like an icon of the Virgin Mary. So in that way, they're in general much more inclusivist than Abrahamic religions like Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. So Sirdi Sai Baba was regarded as an avatar of the god Dattatreya by his Hindu followers. Dattatreya is an avatar himself of the Trimurti, the so-called Hindu Trinity, who is depicted as having 3 heads and 6 arms. He's both a monk and a lord of yoga or meditation. So this thing of having a saint who's neither Hindu nor Muslim, such people are more often incorporated into Hinduism in South Asia than they are into Islam. Islam is by comparison more exclusivist. So when you see these kind of interfaith gurus, in the long run, more commonly, they become regarded as saints and they're revered within Hinduism rather than Islam. Kabir is another example of that. So a 20th century guru, Satya Sai Baba, claimed to be an avatar or reincarnation of Sirdi Sai Baba and also of the gods Shiva and Shakti. So he had a very large following, including many Western converts. He became very popular in the 1960s and 70s during the countercultural movement. So he still has a lot of followers who revere him today, although there have been some controversies and accusations surrounding him. So, for example, I believe it was the skeptic and magician debunker James Randi, but there may have been others as well, who accused him of practicing sleight of hand. So Satya Sai Baba would often manifest gold watches and other things to his followers, and he was sometimes accused of basically just palming objects like a stage magician would. He's also been accused of other crimes, including sexual abuse of minor boys, money laundering, fraud, and even murder. I haven't dug into this. I don't have an opinion about whether he's guilty of any of these accusations. But the reason why I mention them is just to point out that with some of these gurus, in addition to the stories of inspiration, of miracles, of healing, of people finding enlightenment through them, there can also be stories that are more troublesome of crimes and abuse. So we sometimes see those going together. And this is kind of an issue, I would say, to be fair, with religion generally, where it doesn't always happen. Religion is not always correlated with abuse, but sometimes religious authorities, because they have so much influence over other people in their community, they can sometimes abuse that power. There are also women gurus in Hinduism. Now, overall, Hinduism is a pretty patriarchal religion. So traditionally, and still to this day, men are often given more authority or status than women. But nevertheless, there have been many women spiritual teachers, including some who are regarded as saints or even as incarnations of God. So just a couple are Sarada Devi, who is the widow of the Advaita Vedanta teacher Ramakrishna, Mira Alfasa, who's the mother of the Aurobindo organization, and Mata Amritanandamayi, who's the so-called hugging guru. So she often expresses loving devotion and charity through hugging her followers. Chapter 16, Worship and Festivals. The oldest type of Hindu worship is the yajna, or Vedic sacrifice, featuring offerings to gods such as Indra, the god of the storms and rain, Surya, god of the sun, Agni, god of the fire, and Soma, god of the intoxicating substance of the same name. So the animal sacrifices were less common, but they included goats, cows, and horses. Apparently, these are still practiced by some Indians, Hindus, especially in the villages, but they're very rare. The vast majority of Hindus nowadays are opposed to animal sacrifice. More common sacrifices practiced today to the fire altar are oblations or liquid offerings of ghee, clarified butter, honey, or milk, and also grain or other things can be thrown into the fire. So the original Vedic religion is focused on these ceremonies of offerings to the fire. But in the Upanishads, this gets reinterpreted so that even if the rituals are still performed, their esoteric, secret, or spiritual meaning of sacrifice of worldly attachments or of the small self or ego is what is highlighted. And there is also another type of offering, oblations to a Shiva lingam. So the lingam is going to be a stone cylinder that represents the god Shiva. And the oblation could be milk or honey poured on top of it. So this is a non-Vedic type of sacrifice, but it's similar in that these material goods are being offered to the god. So the Shiva Lingam worship apparently evolved around the same time as the sectarian Shaivism and the temple rituals. Puja, or worship or prayer, is the most common type of worship in Hinduism. So this is usually chants or prayers to a god. It could also include other types of offerings given to an image or icon of the god on an altar. So at a temple, this would be led by a Brahmin, and there'd be a sanctified image or murti of the deity on the altar. And usually the Brahmin will purify himself in the shrine, invoke the presence of the deity in the image, worship the image by bathing it, adorning it, symbolically feeding it, and then offering it lights such as a little candle or oil lamp. And fruits and other offerings can be presented, incense as well. So there are Sanskrit mantras that will usually be chanted, conches can be blown, and bells rung as well as part of the ceremony. So the murtis are those images or icons of a god or goddess, usually anthropomorphic. Sometimes they have animal features. Sometimes they have multiple arms or multiple heads. Usually those are symbolizing the many-sided power of the deity. And as mentioned previously, a sanctified murti, that's one where the Brahmin has performed a special ritual over it, is believed to contain the actual presence of the deity. So it's treated as a sacred object. Most Hindus also have smaller, simpler altars at their home where they perform puja, and it's just going to be a simplified version of the temple puja. In the photograph on the slide is actually home puja being led by a Brahmin, though, which also sometimes happens. Now, even though puja is the most common form of worship or just general practice in Hinduism, it's performed by all Hindus. Some Hindus also want to emphasize yoga, like a spiritual discipline, like meditation instead. This kind of goes back to the idea of the Upanishads that the normal or external ritual, while it is legitimate, it is meaningful, it is good, it's not the most profound or deep way of understanding the nature of the self and the nature of the divine. And so practices like meditation, which kind of focus the attention inward, allow people to examine their consciousness, their true nature. Some Hindus might regard that as a kind of deeper or more profound level of practice. There are other forms of worship in Hinduism as well. It's common to have chants from the Veda, so these can be performed apart from the Vedic yajna or fire altar rituals, even though the chants themselves come from the original Vedic texts. Sandhya Vandanam is salutation to the goddess of twilight, and this is performed by most Hindus 3 times per day, at morning, noon, and evening. The main part of the Sandhya Vandanam is the Gayatri mantra, and this mantra is dedicated to the sun god Savitar. Gayatri is the goddess after whom the meter of the chant is named. There's also bhajana or bhajans, which are hymns or devotional songs to a god or goddess. And these have been especially popular the last, 500 or more years in Hinduism. So a lot of the greatest religious poetry of Hindu saints is often recited in the form of songs to accompany Indian classical music or sometimes dance as well. There's also Sahasranama, which is reciting the 1,000 names of God or of gods and goddesses, different versions of it. And then an example of a yoga sequence, a Hatha yoga sequence, is Surya Namaskar or sun salutation. So I note this just because there are many examples of yoga poses and mantras and breath control that could be also interpreted as a form of worship. So for example, the literal meaning of Surya Namaskar is saluting or greeting Surya, the god of the sun. And the picture is a bhajan being sung by a group of Hindus on Navratri, a festival honoring the goddess. The literal meaning is 9 nights. So there are a lot of sacred sites in Hinduism, places where a god may have appeared in the world, where something divine may have fallen from heaven to earth, where a saint may have been buried. These can all become places of pilgrimage. So pilgrimage sites are often visited during festivals as well. There's a long tradition of sacred rivers, perhaps going back to the Indus Valley civilization even. The Ganges River is still considered the most sacred. In the photograph is someone performing Ganga Puja on the banks of the Ganges. And bathing in the Ganges River is regarded as a purifying act of merit. There are many cities along the Ganges, but Varanasi is regarded as the holiest. Some animals, such as cows, are regarded as sacred. The idea of a sacred cow probably entered into Hinduism around the first few centuries BC or AD, around the time that worship of Krishna became very prominent. There may be other sources of the sacred status of cows in Hinduism as well, but Krishna is a god of cows, flocks, and herds, and so that's at least one plausible explanation for why it became regarded as sinful to kill or harm a cow. In fact, many Hindus take religious offense at non-Hindu butchers who have killed cows and sold their meat. So sometimes there have even been riots or mob violence by Hindus if they believe, if they suspect, usually it's a Muslim butcher who's targeted if they suspect one of killing a cow. But there also can be other animals regarded as sacred, such as monkeys, especially around temples of Hanuman, the monkey god. And these are not generally regarded as sacred, but in particular temples or areas, the snakes, rats, or other animals could be regarded as sacred under the protection of a local god, typically. And human teachers, gurus, can be regarded as sacred beings in their own right, or as avatars, incarnations of a god or goddess. So when that is the case, people will also flock to gurus to attain darshana of them, just like they might try to get darshana or a sighting of a murti, an icon that has been sanctified to a god or goddess. There are many Hindu festivals throughout the year. Some of them are local to certain parts of India. The Vedic calendar is lunar, so the timing of the festival is going to vary from year to year on the standard Western solar calendar. Many temple festivals involve processions in which worshippers carry the murti of a god or goddess throughout the streets of a city or just around the temple. There are many seasonal festivals celebrated by many Hindus. Here's a partial list. Janmashtami is celebrated usually between July and August, and it's the birthday of Krishna. Ganesh Chaturthi is celebrated in August or September and is dedicated to Ganesha, the elephant-headed god who's the overcomer of obstacles. Dussehra is celebrated from September to October, anywhere in there, and it celebrates the victory of Rama and his army of monkeys over Ravana, the demon king. Navratri is celebrated during the longer Dussehra festival and is dedicated to Durga, celebrates the power of the goddess, her ability to triumph over demons and evil. Diwali is the festival of lights, celebrated somewhere in October or November, and is dedicated to the goddess Sri or Lakshmi, the consort of Vishnu. Shivratri is celebrated between January and February and is dedicated to the god Shiva. And Holi, the festival of colors, it's a spring festival celebrated either in February or March. The picture on the right is from Latmar Holi in Mathura, India. So there are also local festivals that may only be celebrated at a particular city or locale. The most famous is Kumbh Mela, which is actually a series of festivals celebrated over 12 years, and it rotates every 3 years between Hardwar, Nasik, Ujjain, and Allahabad. So the culminating festival of this 12-year cycle is the Purna Kumbh Mela, which is celebrated every 12 years in Allahabad, and millions of people come from all over India to attend that festival. Chapter 17, Hinduism in the Modern World. So there have been many changes in Hinduism over time. So although Hindus continue to believe in all of the gods and goddesses mentioned in the Veda, not all of them have the same prominence as they once did. So Indra was formerly the king of the gods. He is still worshipped, but he's not generally interpreted as Brahman or the supreme being. Rather, it's more common for Vishnu, Shiva, or a goddess to be interpreted as supreme. Another example is the god Varuna, who is still worshipped today. He's usually associated with being a god of the ocean or the sea, but in the early Vedic period, he was very important as an upholder of the cosmic dharma, an enforcer of contracts and covenants. Likewise, some gods became more popular. Vishnu is mentioned in the Veda, but he's a much more prominent god today. At some point, he became associated as one manifestation of Brahman, or the supreme being. Shiva is not named in the Veda, but he's associated with another Vedic god, Rudra, who's a god of storms and mountains. This, by the way, is one of the main methods by which potentially non-Vedic gods become associated with Vedic religion, and thus Hinduism. They become equated with or associated with the god or goddess named in the Veda. So even though the yajna, or fire sacrifice, is still performed today by Hindus everywhere and in temples, other places too, it's declined in significance relatively. If you look at early Vedic religion, especially in that early period from around 1500 to 500 BC, fire sacrifice was the main ritual practice. And in the centuries that followed, other forms of worship or puja at temples, around icons, giving food offerings, flowers, candles, lights, these became more common. So especially with the rise of the bhakti, or devotional Hinduism, in the early centuries AD and after. Things have changed again in the modern period. So those reform movements of the 19th, 20th centuries, they've largely washed over Hinduism, but they have left some lasting marks. So just the idea of Hinduism incorporating ideas from Western culture and religion. There were a lot of campaigns too against certain traditional practices that were regarded as unethical, either by the British rulers or by the Western educated Indian elites, or both, such as sati, which was a practice where a Hindu widow would sometimes, not usually, but some of them would jump on the funeral pyre of their husband and thus immolate themselves. The idea in Hinduism, which does go back to the Dharma Shastras at least, is that a widow doesn't have the same exalted or blessed status as a married woman. Married women are treated as Sri, as holy, as blessed, as being like a goddess, but they lose that status when they become widows. So sati is still opposed by many Hindus, but it's also been actually taken up and advocated by some Hindus in recent decades, largely as a kind of like cultural symbol of Hindu tradition. Also, other practices that were campaigned against in the 19th to 20th centuries by Hindu reformers include things like child marriage and some interpretations or aspects of the caste system, like untouchability. Recently, like I mentioned, there have been a revival of some more traditional forms of Hinduism. It's less kind of fashionable nowadays to support the older sort of Hindu reforms that were more Western influenced. There were several generations of Indian elites who were Western educated, and who often had Western ideology like secularism, socialism, maybe even Western attitudes towards religion. They are more pluralistic or multicultural, more tolerant of other religions. That's still around a little bit, but it's declined in significance. Ironically, as India has become more democratic, the preferences of the common people, which tend to be for Hindutva, for Hinduness, for Hindu nationalism, are more reflected in the government and broader society. So astrology remains very popular in India. It dates back to antiquity. There's a whole Vedic system of astrology, which apparently evolved separately from the Western astrology that's rooted in Babylonian astrology. So, but there's a lot of not only astrology, but other kind of divination performed around people, including by examination of birthmarks and things like that. And a lot of Hindus from India take that very seriously. There's also many modern gurus who are still venerated. One of them, who is in the 20th century, was Swami Prabhupada. He was the founder of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, popularly known as the Hare Krishnas. They're a Vaishnava sect, influenced or in the lineage of the earlier Vaishnava saint Chaitanya, who advocate a kind of joyful, loving worship of Krishna and Rama and Vishnu, expressed through song and chanting and dancing. And they were a bit unlike other sects in that they actively sought out Westerners and other non-Hindus as converts. Satya Sai Baba, as I mentioned previously, is regarded as a reincarnation of the earlier saint Sirdi Sai Baba. And Bhagavan Rajneesh, he's more of an outlier, didn't necessarily even identify as Hindu. He was very influenced by Buddhism, by Western philosophy, by many different philosophies and esoteric traditions. Later in life, he became known as Osho. He had many Western followers, and that was kind of like a larger trend you see with some of the 20th century Indian gurus. So traditionally, missionary activity among Hindu sects was mainly aimed at reconverting lapsed Hindus. So these are people who were from Hindu families or were born Hindu but had converted to Christianity or Islam. And all that was required for them to return to Hinduism was a purification or Shuddhi ceremony. On some interpretations, people can really only be Hindu if they're born into a Hindu family and caste, because Westerners or other non-Indians wouldn't have a jati or caste, so they don't totally fit in to the jati varna system. But there are some modern sects and gurus who do recruit Westerners, as previously mentioned. India attained independence from Great Britain in 1947, and this led to a partition of India between the majority Muslim parts, known as Pakistan, and the majority Hindu parts, known as India. There were also other territories part of the British East India Empire, such as Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and Burma, that became independent nations. But most of the conflict was between India and Pakistan. Pakistan originally had two parts: West Pakistan along the Indus River in the west, and East Pakistan along the Bay of Bengal around the mouth of the Ganges River in the east. These eventually, though, became two separate countries in the 1970s. East Pakistan became Bangladesh. So India, even though it was majority Hindu, and that was part of the reason why it was separated from Pakistan, largely because the Muslim independence activists in British India didn't want to be a part of a majority Hindu nation. So they actually lobbied the British to have a separate country. They were successful in this. There were some edge cases. Some of the complexity surrounding partition is shown on this map. The provinces in green became Pakistan, those in orange, India, but there were some large princely states that originally were independent. They didn't accept either country. They were quickly divided up, though, between India and Pakistan. The most controversial of these territorial acquisitions was Kashmir, which was majority Muslim, but later in the game, the prince who ruled Kashmir declared for India. India claimed it as their own. It was actually divided between Pakistan and India. The part that's administered by India is still majority Muslim and largely opposed to Indian rule. For a while, there was a movement for them to unify with Pakistan, which Pakistan still wants, but most people who are Kashmir, are independence activists. They want to be independent from both Pakistan and India. So this was a long, messy, violent process. There was a lot of conflict between migrating groups of Hindus and Muslims, because even though the areas designated as Pakistan were majority Muslim, there are a lot of Hindus mixed in, and vice versa in India. So at this time, the vast majority of the population of both Pakistan and Bangladesh are Muslim. India is majority Hindu, but it also has a sizable Muslim minority. So India was originally founded as a secular state with religious freedom. The Congress Party supported this. Nehru and Gandhi, I mentioned earlier. Gandhi was Hindu like Nehru, even though he was, in a sense, more of a traditionalist or more in line with Hindu traditions than Nehru. Gandhi was still very pluralistic. He was against the untouchability aspect of the Hindu caste system, and also he promoted tolerance towards Muslims. He was actually assassinated by people associated with the Hindu nationalist or Hindutva movement, including people associated with the BJP, which is the party that now controls India. So this conflict between Hindus and Muslims, this assassination of Gandhi because he was accused of not being sufficiently pro-Hindu, because he was accused by Hindutva activists at the time of being too friendly to the Muslims. These tensions are still alive in India today. So even though India was created as a secular state, the majority of the population is Hindu, and it must be said, most of the people, it appears, want to see those Hindu values promoted by the state at the level of the government. So secularism is less popular among most Indians today. And a lot of the earlier generations of Western educated elites, like Nehru, Gandhi, their successors, their family members, several generations out, they're still around, but they actually have less power now in India, in part because India has become more democratic, And the taste, the preferences, the voting of the majority of Indians are now reflected in new generations of rulers who tend to be less aligned with Western liberalism or progressivism or pluralism and more aligned with Hindutva, Hindu nationalism. I mean, obviously, there's complexities and exceptions. India also has state governments that have a great deal of diversity, but that's been the overall trend in recent decades. And you can see modern Hindu nationalism in part as a response to the previous eras of Muslim and Christian/European imperialism. So that's in part why it's often hostile towards those religions. There's also still considerable hostility between the different groups of Indian elites, some aligned with Hindutva, some not. Um, so there's a complicated web of organizations that are Hindu nationalist. What they have in common is just promoting the idea of India as a Hindu state in various senses of that. So the RSS, VHP, and BJP are different examples. The BJP is the political party, the one that actually has a majority in parliament and currently is in control of India. But another example is Bajrang Dal, which is a militant Hindu nationalist organization. And you can see elements of Hindutva in the society. Like there's this thing called saffronization, which is a nickname for the spread of Hindutva ideology. For example, in school textbooks, named after the fact that saffron robes are often worn by Hindu monks. You can see in the map on the slide how the different states of India have different laws about the legality of slaughtering animals. But the severity of these laws reflect Hindu piety. So the idea is there are some states where you are permitted to sacrifice or to butcher cows, bulls, and buffaloes, mainly in the east, in the areas that have larger proportions of Christians and Muslims, and in the southwest. So those are all around areas that have sizable Christian or Muslim populations. But in the other states, there's going to be various levels of legal bans on killing animals. So in the yellow states, it's only permissible to kill bulls and buffaloes, but not cows. In the red states, it's permissible only to kill buffaloes, but not bulls or cows. And in the maroon states, it's not permissible to kill any of those. And there have been, as I mentioned previously, occasional riots or outbreaks of violence against butchers who've been accused of breaking the laws. So there's this idea in Hinduism that cows especially are very sacred to the god Krishna and to other gods, and that it's offense against the religion to harm them. So Hindus in general don't eat beef, or they're not supposed to. Some Hindus are vegetarian. Usually they're Vaishnavas or Brahmins. Most Hindus actually do eat meat, but just not beef. But you can see how some of these Hindu pieties are being expressed in the laws. And so you could look at India, even though it's still nominally a secular government, it's more aligned with Hinduism all in all than with other religions. So there is a worldwide Hindu diaspora or dispersal of Hindus around the world. Largely, this is not the remnant of the earlier phase of expansion of Hinduism in antiquity into Southeast Asia and the East Indies, but rather in the waves of migration that happened during the British Empire and after. So during the British Empire era, you get Hindus migrating to the British colony of Guyana on the north coast of South America, to South Africa, to Malaysia, and to some other parts of the British Empire. After World War II, you get migration to other countries, often Anglophone, but not always. Many Indian Hindus speak English because that was the language of the British administration, and it's still used for a lot of purposes in India today for just like a national language. They have a bunch of different local languages. There are some very common ones spoken by lots of people, like Hindi in the north, Tamil in the south, but there's a lot of regional languages as well. So English is still actually used a lot for administration. So a lot of Hindu migrants to other countries prefer to go to English-speaking countries because they can already speak the language, like Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States, South Africa. But they have, you can see on the map, representation in other countries as well, such as Malaysia, Indonesia, and these diaspora Hindus, they often still retain a sense of connection to India. So they regard India as the source of their religion, the source of their culture, and they may return there to participate in festivals, or even to visit particular shrines or gurus. So the caste system does go back to the early Veda, but really the part that's mentioned in the Veda is only the 4 Varnas. And those do have an impact on Hindu culture and religion, so only Brahmins are allowed to become priests to this day. But the thing that impacts life as well a lot is jati. So usually people only marry within the same jati, to only form close friends within the same jati. Jatis could be thought of as subdivisions of the Varnas because all or most of the jatis are associated with one of the Varnas. So in other words, there are many jatis that fall within the Brahmin Varna. There are many jatis that fall within the Vaishya Varna, etc. The Gotras I mentioned previously, those are clans that are believed to be descended from sages of the early Veda, and those are traced from the male side of the family, the male lineage. And the usual custom is you must marry within your jati, and thus within your Varna, but you must marry from a different Gotra. One of the types of caste that I only hinted at before is the so-called untouchables, or chandalas, nowadays called dalits, which means scattered or broken. So these were regarded as people who were even below the Shudras in status. They were regarded as impure and thus not worthy of being touched by higher caste Hindus. And there could be different reasons for that. Some were just never a part of the caste system because they could be tribal peoples or ones that weren't a part of ancient Aryan cultures, or because they engaged in occupations like leatherworking that were considered polluting or impure. So some Hindu reformers were critical of untouchability, like Mohandas K. Gandhi was an example of that, as well as Dayananda Sarasvati. And even though they were Hindu, they wanted to reform the Hindu society to get rid of the idea of untouchability, or that certain people are inherently impure. The modern Indian constitution tried to make provisions for the Dalits and other lower castes. These are called scheduled castes in Indian law, and they had certain positions in government and at universities reserved for them. This provision for these untouchable or underprivileged castes has been somewhat watered down by recent BJP administrations because they don't like the idea of special provisions that only benefit the Dalits. Many of the people who are influential in the BJP, at least in the leadership, are from higher castes like Brahmins, and they still retain those traditional ideas of Dalits as being impure. This is kind of an oversimplification. It's much more complicated than all that, but for a variety of reasons, they have created a more expanded list of scheduled castes that include not just Dalits or others who were traditionally outside the caste system, but people from the higher caste as well. So those scheduled caste provisions of retaining spots at university or in government jobs for the Dalits have been significantly watered down. There's also been conflicts between people who have a traditional caste, those are Savarnas, and the Avarnas, or people outside the caste system, like the tribal peoples and Dalits who would have very low status. Sometimes this breaks out into violence. So this has been part of this larger process of trying to re-emphasize the validity of Hindu traditions, including Varna, including Jati, including even untouchability, and even going so far as some Hindutva activists to advocate sati as a noble thing for a widow to do, to kill herself by jumping on the funeral pyre of her husband as an act of self-sacrifice, as an act of devotion. This wouldn't necessarily be a majority of Hindus support that, but there's been a revival of this kind of appeal to tradition. And part, it feels like it's been a kind of national identity process, that the Hindutva movement is kind of trying to create an Indian national identity. We have to say that this is connected to the larger fact that India is a very large country. It has over 1 billion population, and as it develops economically, develops militarily, it seems to be becoming a great power. And I don't know, I feel that's kind of connected to the idea of the Hindutva, the idea of the awakening Indian national consciousness. And there's a huge amount of diversity still within India. Even among the Hindus, they have different languages, they have different castes, they have different local traditions and customs. And so I think the Hindutva movement has been intended in part as a way of unifying the country, although it does exacerbate those divisions between religions and occasionally the caste divisions as well. So there's also been a process throughout the history of Hinduism, apparently, of what's called Sanskritization. This is the reinterpretation of non-Hindu and often non-Sanskrit gods and practices as Hindu. One of the ways this happens is you have a god or goddess that's worshipped in a part of India, but is not named in the Vedas, so it was not a part of Vedic religion, but they become associated with the Vedic god, often interpreted as an avatar or a manifestation of that god. Because of the belief in avatars, because of the Hindu belief that gods can manifest in many forms, this actually makes it very easy for Hinduism to incorporate non-Vedic traditions and effectively bring them into the fold. So one example of this is the god Madhapan, who's worshipped by some in Kerala and Karnataka in southern India. And this god is interpreted as a combined form of Vishnu and Shiva. Women in modern Hinduism, largely there still are traditional gender roles and attitudes in India. There's a lot of patriarchal attitudes there, the idea that men should have more authority, but things have also changed a lot in the last few decades as more women have become educated, entered the workforce, and so on. So you get both change and the persistence of tradition. So some of the traditional views of women we can see in the story of Sita, who was a loyal and submissive wife to her husband Rama. And towards the end of her life, she was basically accused without basis of infidelity against her husband when she was in captivity to the demon king Ravana. But she asked the earth to bear witness to her not violating her relationship with her husband and of her honesty, and the earth swallowed her up and took her away. This act of self-sacrifice of Sita is often cited as a justification, by the way, for the continuance of the sati practice. Savitri is a princess who saves her husband Satyavan from death. You can see a modern painting of that, where Yama, or death, is shown as a kind of shadow. So her husband is ill, and she basically is able to beg and plead with Yama to not take her husband, and he's able to survive. So again, the idea of the woman standing in the way of harm for her husband, sacrificing herself for the sake of her husband. I already mentioned the idea that widows are no longer considered blessed or Sri. And so the most blessed state for a woman in traditional Hindu culture is to be married. So Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar was a reformer who supported a law permitting Hindu widows to remarry. This was back in 1856. So before then, it was actually against the law in India, in British India, for Hindus who were widows to remarry. There were actually different laws in British India for people of different religions. So I think the idea that British had was that people of each religion should have some freedom to be ruled by their own laws, but it created this, like multi-tiered legal system. In any event, you can see the fact that they had to pass that law. There is a strong tradition that widows should not remarry. They should not, in a sense, be unfaithful to their deceased husband by taking another. It's still considered, I think, by a lot of traditional Hindus today to be more fitting or appropriate for a Hindu widow to not remarry, but it is legal to do so in modern India. There are also Indian feminists, including some Hindu feminists. One example of a just secular feminist organization is the Working Women's Forum. So this is kind of like a signal or embodiment of the fact that large numbers of women have entered the workforce in India, have become educated, they become an important part of the economy and the society. The textbook also points out a few feminist filmmakers of Indian ethnicity. Meera Nair is an Indian American who's famous for the film Monsoon Wedding and so on. Deepa Mehta is an Indian-born Canadian who had a trilogy of films called Elements. So one thing about this is that we have to make a distinction between Indian filmmakers or artists who were born and educated in the West and who are beloved by Western scholars or Western elites. They are sometimes also beloved in India by Hindus there, but the general trend is that India is still more conservative, more traditional, and people there will not always look kindly, even on people who share their ethnicity, but who have more secular, Western, or other non-Hindu values. So it must be said as well that Western scholars tend to oppose the aspects of Hinduism, traditional Hindu culture, that are not feminist, and tend to promote the spread of feminism in India. And some Hindu women support that, and other Hindus too. But it's also very controversial. And there's even kind of like a weird element of cultural imperialism involved in this. So a lot of traditional Hindus in India, they regard the attempt to impose feminism and other Western values as a kind of imperial cultural imposition from the West, and they would rather preserve their own traditions, albeit ones that may have more restrictions for the role of women in society. So that's it for our summary of Hinduism. Next up is part 4, Buddhism. And if you're participating in my class at Pasadena City College, we're actually going to skip ahead to part 6 of the textbook, Jainism, just because that fits more with the historical sequence of moving from Hinduism to Jainism, which is another religion that started in India in antiquity. So until next time.